On summer nights, the air in small American towns always carried something different than in the daylight. During the day, streets buzzed with life, kids running through sprinklers, people mowing lawns, the smell of barbecue drifting from backyards. But when the sun sank and the heat clung to the asphalt, the town felt different, lonely, stretched thin. I grew up in a neighborhood in northern Ohio surrounded by woods and cornfields. The nights there had a way of pressing in, heavy and full of silence, broken only by crickets, frogs, or the occasional car on the distant highway. That summer, I was 17, and I swore nothing could scare me anymore. I thought I was grown, thought I understood the world, but I didn't. Not until that one night changed how I looked at darkness forever. It started like most nights did back then. A group of us had been hanging out by my friend Matt's house. His parents were out of town, and even though we didn't have alcohol or anything crazy, we loved the idea of staying out late without adults checking in. We'd been sitting on the porch, swatting away mosquitoes, telling stupid stories, and laughing too loud. Around 10, someone suggested we walk down to the quarry. That was a place we all knew but didn't visit often, especially after dark. The quarry was about 2 miles from Matt's place, hidden off an old service road that cut through the woods. During the day, it was beautiful. Deep water surrounded by high rock walls, the kind of place where kids dared each other to jump. At night, though, it was a black pit that locals whispered about. I'd heard the rumors for years, kids drowning, strange figures in the trees, even someone disappearing back in the 80s. But none of us believed it. We treated those stories like just another campfire tale. So when Matt grinned and said, "Let's go down there. It'll be creepy as hell," we all agreed. There were 6 of us, me, Matt, his cousin Ryan, 2 girls named Julia and Erin, and a quiet kid named Caleb who didn't usually hang out with us. Caleb lived a couple blocks over, kept to himself, but Matt had invited him along. I didn't know him well, but he was tall and awkward, with that look like he was always thinking about something else. We set out just after 10. The air was thick, humid enough that sweat clung to the back of my neck even as we walked. The streetlights ended about half a mile from Matt's, and after that, we were swallowed by darkness, the kind you only get in places far from the city. We had a couple of flashlights between us, their weak beams bouncing over the gravel road. Every so often, a bat swooped low or a branch snapped in the woods, and one of the girls would shriek, followed by laughter. I tried to play it cool, but I'll admit I felt uneasy. By the time we reached the quarry, the moon had climbed high, washing everything in pale light. The place looked endless, the water so dark it seemed bottomless. We found a spot on the edge where the rocks flattened out, and we sat down, our voices echoing off the walls. Someone tossed a pebble into the water, and the ripples spread, disappearing into nothing. It should have been fun, just a bunch of teenagers daring each other to go closer to the edge, talking about ghosts. But almost immediately, something felt off. It wasn't just the usual creepiness of the woods at night. It was quieter than it should have been. The frogs and insects that had filled the air on the walk down were suddenly gone. I noticed it first, and when I pointed it out, everyone laughed nervously. "Maybe they just don't like the quarry," Julia said, but her voice trembled. We tried to shake it off, making jokes, but after a while, we all started glancing at the tree line. It felt like we weren't alone, like someone was out there watching. At one point, Caleb stood up suddenly, his flashlight beam slicing into the trees. "Did you see that?" he asked, his voice sharper than I'd ever heard it. We crowded around, squinting into the shadows, but there was nothing there, just branches swaying in the hot breeze. Ryan laughed and told him to relax, but I saw Caleb's hands shaking. We stayed another 20 minutes or so, trying to pretend nothing was wrong. But then Erin gasped, pointing across the water. On the far side of the quarry, maybe 50 yards away, there was movement. A figure, pale and thin, stood just beyond the edge of the rocks. At first, I thought it was a trick of the moonlight, but then it shifted, stepping back, then forward again, like it couldn't decide whether to come closer. Nobody spoke. We just stared. The figure didn't move like a person should. Its head tilted too far to one side, its arms dangling strangely. I tried to tell myself it was someone messing with us, maybe another group of kids who'd had the same idea. But deep down, I knew it wasn't. Finally, Matt shouted, "Hey, who's there?" His voice echoed across the water, bouncing off the quarry walls. The figure didn't answer, it just stood there, watching. Then slowly, it crouched down. The movement was unnatural, spider-like. Aaron started crying. That broke us. Matt grabbed Julia's hand, and we all bolted for the trail. Our flashlights bounced wildly as we tore back into the woods, branches whipping against our arms and faces. Behind us, I swore I could hear something. Footsteps, snapping twigs, maybe even breathing. But I didn't dare look back. The run back felt endless. By the time we burst onto the gravel road, we were drenched in sweat, panting, and half in tears. We didn't stop until Matt's house came into view. Inside, with the lights on and the doors locked, we tried to laugh it off, but nobody could shake what we'd seen. Caleb sat in silence, staring at the floor. He didn't come around much after that night, and when I passed him in the halls at school, he barely nodded. I thought maybe that was the end of it, just one terrifying encounter that we'd tell as a story years later. But it wasn't. The next night, I was lying in bed, the window open to let in the summer air. My room overlooked the backyard, which stretched into the woods. Around 2 a.m, I woke up to the sound of tapping, soft, rhythmic, against the glass. At first, I thought it was just a branch in the wind, but then I sat up and looked. There, standing in the yard at the edge of the trees, was the same figure from the quarry. Pale, thin, head tilted. It was too far to see its face, but I knew it was watching me. My chest went cold. The tapping came again, and I realized it wasn't from a branch. It was from inside the room, near the corner where the shadows pooled. I froze. My eyes darted, but there was nothing there. Nothing I could see, at least. When I looked back at the window, the figure was gone. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. And over the next weeks, strange things kept happening. Footsteps in the gravel outside when nobody should have been there. Whispers under my window. Once, I woke up to find muddy handprints smeared across the glass. I told Matt about it, but he brushed it off. "You're just freaked out from the quarry," he said. But I knew it was more than that. The others must have known too, because nobody wanted to talk about that night again. Aaron moved away before school started, and Julia refused to go near the woods. The last time I saw it was late August. I was walking home from a friend's place after midnight, the cicadas buzzing in the trees. As I cut across a patch of empty lots near the woods, I felt that familiar prickling sensation, the one that told me I wasn't alone. I turned, and there it was again, standing under a streetlight this time, its pale body fully visible. It looked almost human, but not quite. Its limbs were too long, its head bent at an impossible angle. It didn't move toward me. It just stood there, watching, until a car came down the street. In the headlights, it vanished, gone in the blink of an eye. I never told anyone about that last time. Eventually, the sightings stopped. Life went on. But even now, years later, I can't drive past that old service road without my stomach twisting. And on summer nights when the air is thick and still, I sometimes wake up to tapping at the window. I never open the blinds. Story the end. On the hottest nights of July in the Midwest, when the air felt thick enough to drink and the chorus of cicadas drowned out nearly everything else, I used to think nothing bad could ever happen. Summers meant bonfires, late-night drives with the windows rolled down, and just enough freedom to feel like life stretched out endlessly. But one summer night proved me wrong, and it's a memory that clings to me even now, years later, as if the heat of that night is still on my skin. It was the summer after my sophomore year of college. I had gone home to my small town in Indiana where nights moved slow and boredom often drove us into doing stupid things. There were 5 of us that night. Me, my best friend Tyler, his girlfriend Amber, and 2 others, Marcus and Sarah. We weren't doing anything remarkable at first, just hanging around Tyler's place, drinking cheap beer and listening to music. The air conditioning had broken in his house, so we migrated outside around midnight, hoping the night air would feel cooler than the suffocating inside. It didn't. The heat sat on us like a heavy blanket, sweat beating on our necks even as we sprawled out on the back porch. Amber started complaining about the mosquitoes, swatting her bare legs with exaggerated disgust, and Marcus suggested we take a drive. He had his dad's old Chevy Blazer for the summer, a car with no working radio, but enough space for all of us to pile inside. We didn't have a destination at first, just just rolling down the county roads with the windows open, headlights bouncing across cornfields that looked like dark oceans. The conversations in the car turned silly and loose, fueled by the alcohol, until we reached the long gravel road that cut through the woods near Miller's Lake. That road was the kind of place kids in town always whispered about, a magnet for ghost stories and dares, though most of them were exaggerated. Still, when Marcus slowed the car and turned onto it, the laughter quieted. The woods swallowed the car almost instantly. The gravel crunched under the tires, and the trees pressed close, branches reaching over the narrow road like skeletal fingers. The air inside the Blazer cooled slightly as the shade blocked out the thick summer moonlight, and Sarah shivered even though it was still unbearably hot. "Why are we going this way?" she asked, leaning forward from the back seat. "Because this is where shit actually happens," Marcus grinned, his voice just a little too eager. "You ever heard about the old guy who lived out here? The one who disappeared?" Amber groaned and rolled her eyes. "God, not this again. Every town has some creepy recluse who mysteriously vanished. It's always bullshit." Tyler smirked, draping his arm over the seat behind her. "You're just scared." "I'm not scared," she shot back. "I just think you guys make stuff up to sound edgy." Marcus kept driving, though his eyes darted occasionally to the trees. I knew the story he was talking about. Everyone did. Years ago, there'd been this man named Clyde Miller, who supposedly lived in a shack deep in the woods. People claimed he went crazy after his wife died, spent years rambling to himself, setting traps around his property, even threatening kids who wandered too close. One summer, he just disappeared. Some said he'd killed himself in the woods. Others whispered that he'd gone feral, living like an animal out there. Of course, nobody ever found a body, and his shack eventually rotted into nothing. But people still swore the woods were haunted, cursed, or worse. I didn't believe half of it. Still, as Marcus slowed the car to a crawl, I found myself staring out the window, watching the tree line as though something might move between the trunks. The deeper we went, the quieter it got. The sound of cicadas fading until there was only the crunch of gravel under the tires. Then the engine sputtered. Marcus cursed and tapped the gas. The Blazer jerked forward, coughed, and then died. The headlights cut out, plunging us into darkness. A moment later, the dash went black. "You've got to be kidding me," Amber muttered, clutching Tyler's arm. Marcus twisted the key in the ignition, but nothing happened. Just a dull click. He tried again. Still nothing. The night outside pressed in heavier, the darkness so complete it felt like the trees themselves were breathing against the windows. "Well," Marcus said, his voice strained but trying to sound casual, "guess she finally gave up." "Out here?" Sarah snapped. "You couldn't have broken down literally anywhere else?" Tyler pulled his phone out of his pocket, the glow briefly illuminating his face. "No service," he muttered. One by one, the rest of us checked our phones. Same thing. Dead zones weren't uncommon in the woods, but the timing made it feel intentional, like the night had cut us off on purpose. "Maybe we should just walk back," Amber suggested, her voice low. "We're not that far from the highway, right?" Marcus shook his head. "Couple miles at least, and that's if we don't get lost in the dark." "Then what do we do?" Sarah asked, panic edging into her tone. Nobody answered at first. We just sat there, the heat suffocating inside the silent car, listening to the forest. I swear it felt louder the longer we sat, crickets picking up again, owls calling, and something else, a rhythmic rustling like footsteps moving slowly through the underbrush. "Did you hear that?" Amber whispered. We all froze. The sound was faint, but deliberate. Crunch, pause, crunch. "Probably a deer," Marcus said, though he didn't sound convinced. Tyler leaned forward, peering through the windshield. "Then why'd it stop?" The forest went silent again, as if holding its breath. That's when Sarah screamed. Her hand shot out, pointing toward the passenger side window. "There! I saw something, right there!" Marcus whipped his head, but there was nothing. Just black trees and tangled brush. He opened his mouth to argue. But then we all heard it, a low whistle. Slow, tuneless, drifting out from somewhere in the woods. It was close. Too close. Amber clamped her hands over her ears. "Tell me that was one of you." "Shut up," Marcus hissed. His eyes were wide now, his bravado crumbling. The whistle carried on, lazy and almost mocking, before fading. Then the crunching footsteps started again, circling the car this time. None of us moved. My heart pounded so loud I thought, Whoever or whatever was out there could hear it. I tried to rationalize, telling myself it was some drunk hiker or a hunter screwing with us. But deep down, I knew. The sound wasn't random. It had a rhythm, a patience that didn't belong to an animal or some harmless passerby. Tyler reached under his seat and pulled out the small metal bat he kept in his car. If it's some asshole messing with us, I'll handle it. Before anyone could stop him, he shoved the door open. The dome light flickered on, spilling pale light into the trees. For a second, I thought I saw movement just beyond the glow, a figure, tall and thin, slipping back into the dark. "Tyler, get back in the car," I whispered, my throat dry. But he didn't. He stepped out onto the gravel, gripping the bat tight, scanning the trees. The forest was silent again, too silent, like the night itself was waiting. Then, faintly, the whistle started again. This time, it was behind him. I'll never forget the way his face changed in that moment. All the cocky bravado vanished, replaced by pure, raw fear. He spun, raising the bat, but the whistle cut off, leaving only the sound of his ragged breathing. "Get in the car!" Sarah shrieked. He scrambled back inside, slamming the door shut and locking it. "There's someone out there," he said, his voice shaking. "I swear to God, there's someone out there." None of us argued. The fear in his voice was enough. We sat there for what felt like hours, sweating in the dead car, straining our ears. Sometimes we'd hear it again, the crunch of footsteps, the whistle, or the faint snap of a branch. Sometimes it would stop for so long we thought whoever it was had gone. Then it would start again, closer, always closer. At some point, Marcus whispered, "We can't just sit here all night." But before anyone could answer, something slammed against the back of the Blazer, hard. The whole car rocked. Amber screamed. Sarah started sobbing. Tyler gripped the bat like his life depended on it. Then, as suddenly as it came, the noise stopped. The forest fell silent again, thick and oppressive. We didn't move. We barely breathed. When the first hints of dawn lightened the trees, the sounds finally stopped for good. We waited another hour before Marcus dared to try the ignition again. This time, the engine roared to life on the first turn, as if nothing had ever been wrong. None of us spoke the entire drive back to town. Later, when I told my dad what happened, he just shook his head. "Shouldn't have gone out there," he said simply. "People disappear in those woods." I wanted to ask him what he meant, but the look in his eyes stopped me. We never went back. In fact, most of us never talked about it again. Tyler broke up with Amber a month later. Sarah transferred schools, and Marcus sold the Blazer before summer ended. It was like that night fractured something between us, something we couldn't repair. But sometimes when I'm lying awake on hot summer nights with the window open, I swear I still hear it, that slow, tuneless whistle drifting through the dark. Story, the end. The air that night was heavy with the kind of warmth only a mid-July evening in the Midwest could hold. It was the kind of sticky summer heat that clung to your skin even after the sun dipped below the horizon, leaving the sky painted in streaks of violet and fading gold. Cicadas buzzed from the trees, and fireflies pulsed faint green glows above the tall grass. It was supposed to be a relaxing night, the kind of evening you remembered from childhood, barefoot in the grass, sitting on the porch with a glass of sweet tea, or walking with friends under the flickering glow of street lamps. But what happened that night was nothing like the warmth of nostalgia. It was a night that still wakes me up in cold sweats, heart racing, ears straining for sounds that aren't there. I was 23 that summer, freshly out of college and back in my hometown for a short while before starting a new job in Chicago. My old friend group had mostly scattered, some married, some already entrenched in careers, some who'd simply drifted away, but a few of us were still around. That night I was with Ben and Lisa, two friends I'd known since middle school. We didn't really have plans other than killing time together like we always had. We drove around aimlessly for a while, windows down, music too loud, then stopped for milkshakes at a late-night diner. It was one of those nights where no one really wanted to go home yet, but we didn't know what else to do. Ben was the one who suggested we go out to the old lake. It wasn't really a lake, more like a man-made reservoir a few miles outside town. People used to swim there back in high school, sneaking out late at night to hang out on the gravel shore or drink beers under the stars. It had been years since I'd been out there, but I remembered the place well. The road leading to it wound through cornfields and patches of dark forest before opening up to that still expanse of water. Lisa hesitated, saying she wasn't sure if we'd even be allowed out there anymore, but Ben just laughed it off. "It's summer," he said. "Cops don't care. Besides, what else are we going to do?" I agreed, though something in me felt uneasy, even then. Maybe it was just the idea of going back to a place tied to so many reckless memories, or maybe it was the way the night felt. Too quiet, too heavy. We drove out there anyway, the three of us crammed into Ben's aging Ford Explorer. The road grew darker the farther we went, the only light coming from the high beams cutting tunnels through the corn. The windows were still down, and the thick night air smelled of cut hay and damp earth. Somewhere along the road, we passed a dead raccoon sprawled on the shoulder, its fur matted and body bloated. Lisa made a face and muttered, "Gross," while Ben joked that it was an omen. None of us laughed. By the time we reached the reservoir, the moon had risen high enough to spill a silvery glow across the water. The gravel lot was empty, just a stretch of dirt and broken glass leading to the shore. Ben parked close to the water, and we got out, stretching our legs. The night sounds were louder here, the chorus of insects, the croak of distant frogs, but underneath it all the place felt hushed, like the air was holding its breath. We walked down to the edge, the water rippling slightly under the moonlight. Lisa sat on a rock, hugging her knees, while Ben skipped stones across the surface. I stood there just listening, feeling that odd tension build in my chest. Something about the stillness of the reservoir always unnerved me. It was deep, darker than you could imagine in the daytime, and I remembered stories from high school about kids who drowned there. After a while, Lisa said she thought she saw something move out in the water. At first, I thought she was joking, but then I looked where she pointed. There was a ripple, far out from shore, spreading like something had disturbed the surface. Maybe it was a fish, maybe a snapping turtle. But it didn't look like the random splash of wildlife. It looked deliberate, like something gliding just beneath the water. Ben squinted and muttered, "Probably a carp or something." But his voice lacked the usual confidence. We all kept watching as another ripple appeared, closer this time. Then another. Whatever it was, it seemed to be moving toward us. Lisa whispered, "I don't like this," and stood up. Her voice carried an edge I hadn't heard since we were kids telling ghost stories. I tried to laugh it off, saying the same thing Ben had, fish, turtles, maybe even a muskrat, but my words sounded hollow. We decided to walk back to the car, but before we got far, we heard it, a splash, loud, heavy, like someone had thrown a huge rock into the water. It echoed across the reservoir, freezing us in place. I turned around, scanning the water, and that's when I saw it. Something was out there, just beyond the reach of the moonlight. At first, it looked like a head bobbing above the surface. Human. Pale. Still. My stomach dropped, and Lisa gasped, covering her mouth. "Is that?" she started, but the words died. I couldn't answer. I just stared because the longer I looked, the less sense it made. It wasn't swimming, wasn't moving at all. It was just floating there, perfectly upright, facing us. The water lapped around it, but it didn't sink or drift. And though it was too far to see clearly, I swear I could make out eyes, black pits glinting in the moonlight, locked on us. Ben muttered something under his breath and took a step back. I followed, grabbing Lisa's arm. None of us said it out loud, but we all knew we had to leave. We rushed back to the car, gravel crunching under our shoes, hearts pounding. Ben fumbled with the keys, swearing as he tried to jam them into the ignition. That's when we heard it again. Another splash. Closer. I whipped my head toward the shore. The thing, whatever it was gone from the middle of the reservoir. The water rippled near the bank now, just a few yards from where we'd been standing minutes earlier. Something had crossed that impossible distance almost instantly. Lisa screamed, and Ben finally got the engine to roar to life. He threw the car into reverse, tires spitting gravel, then sped out of the lot. None of us spoke as we tore back down the country road, the trees whipping past, the Explorer rattling with every bump. But the night wasn't finished with us. As we drove, I glanced in the side mirror. For a split second, just a second, I saw something on the side of the road. A figure, soaked, pale, standing among the cornstalks, watching us. My chest seized up, and I nearly told Ben to stop the car, but when I looked again, it was gone. just the empty rows of corn shifting in the warm wind. We didn't stop until we were back in town, parked in front of Lisa's house. She was crying quietly, her hands trembling as she tried to light a cigarette. Ben sat rigid in the driver's seat, staring straight ahead, jaw clenched. I finally broke the silence, asking if either of them had seen what I had. Neither answered right away, and I wondered if I was losing my mind. Then Lisa whispered, "It followed us." We sat there for a long time, none of us wanting to be the first to go inside, none of us wanting to be alone. Eventually, Lisa went inside, and I drove with Ben back to his place. We didn't talk about it again that night or the next. It was like an unspoken pact that if we didn't acknowledge it, maybe it wasn't real. But I still dream about that summer night, about the sound of water slapping against the shore, about eyes glinting from the dark, about the figure in the corn, waiting. I don't go near that reservoir anymore. None of us do. And when I'm driving on summer nights, windows down, cicadas buzzing, sometimes I catch myself staring into the shadows at the roadside, half expecting to see it again. Because deep down I know whatever was in that water that night, it wasn't a fish, and it wasn't gone. Story the end. The air on that summer night was heavy with the smell of grass and gasoline, the kind of warmth that clung to your skin even long after the sun dipped below the tree line. I remember the way the sky looked that evening, hazy orange fading into a deep blue, fireflies blinking like dying sparks in the distance. It was a small town in Pennsylvania, the kind of place where everyone knew your name, but the nights felt like they could swallow you whole if you weren't careful. I had been 19 at the time, working long hours at a grocery store, and the weekends were usually my escape. That night, my friends, Eddie, Lisa, and Matt, decided we'd head out to the old quarry just outside of town. It was one of those places you grew up hearing stories about. Kids said people drowned there, others swore they'd seen strange lights in the woods surrounding it, and there was even talk that a girl had gone missing one summer and was never found. I never put much stock into small-town legends, though. They always felt more like warnings meant to keep bored kids from hurting themselves. We packed into Eddie's old Chevy, its rusted sides rattling every time it hit a bump in the road. The windows were rolled down, music blasting, and the warm wind whipped through the cab. Lisa was sitting in the passenger seat with her bare feet up on the dashboard, laughing about something Matt had said. I was in the back, half drifting between conversation and staring out into the blur of farmland that lined the highway. I still remember the way the night smelled, like cut hay, hot asphalt, and the faint tang of pine when the road veered near the tree line. The quarry itself sat off a gravel road, unmarked and nearly forgotten. We had to push through a trail swallowed by weeds just to reach the clearing where the water lay still, black and impossibly deep. It was quiet there, the kind of quiet that makes your skin prickle because you suddenly realize how far you are from anyone else. No cars passing, no dogs barking, no porch lights flickering in the distance, just us and the vast sheet of water under the stars. We laid out blankets near the shore, a cooler of beer between us, and the laughter came easy at first. Eddie told his usual stories, exaggerated until they barely resembled truth, and Lisa teased him relentlessly for it. Matt skipped rocks across the water, the sound of each slap echoing through the still air. But as the night wore on, there was a moment, small, almost unnoticeable at first, when the atmosphere seemed to shift. It started with the frogs. Their croaks, which had been steady since we arrived, stopped all at once. It was like someone had flicked a switch, cutting out all background noise in a single breath. We all noticed it, glancing around the dark tree line, expecting to see something moving out there. But the woods stood still. Eddie chuckled nervously, saying something about how predators probably scared them off, but there weren't any coyotes in our town, and the pause in sound stretched far too long. Then came the ripples. I thought Matt had thrown another rock at first, but when I turned to look, he was sitting perfectly still, his hands on his knees. The water just beyond where the moonlight reached was stirring, slow at first, then faster, as if something large had moved beneath the surface. Lisa muttered something under her breath, clutching her beer tighter. None of us spoke much after that, though we stayed. Maybe because leaving would have meant admitting we were scared, and none of us wanted to be the first. It wasn't until close to midnight that things turned stranger. I had gotten up to stretch my legs and walked a little closer to the tree line when I caught sight of something. A flicker of light, faint and white, like a lantern swaying deep in the woods. My first thought was that it might be other kids messing around, but the light didn't move like a flashlight beam. It bobbed slowly, rhythmically, and there was no sound of footsteps, no snapping branches. I blinked, and it was gone. When I told the others, Eddie smirked and said I was trying to freak them out, but the way his voice cracked betrayed him. Matt kept quiet, though his eyes didn't leave the dark space between the trees. Lisa insisted we pack up, but none of us moved. Looking back, I think it was that strange paralysis that comes with fear. You know something's wrong, but your body won't quite let you acknowledge it yet. The next sound was not subtle. It came sharp and clear from across the water. A splash, loud enough to echo, followed by a gurgling noise that made my stomach twist. Eddie jumped to his feet, swearing under his breath. We all scanned the black surface of the quarry, but there was nothing there. No ripples, no waves, nothing disturbed. Just stillness again, as if we'd imagined it. But I knew we hadn't, because Lisa's face had gone pale in the moonlight, and Matt whispered that he heard breathing. It wasn't ours. The sound was faint but undeniable, ragged and slow, as though someone was exhaling just a few feet behind us. I spun around, hoping to see another group of kids, but there was no one. Just the same wall of trees, branches shifting slightly in the warm night breeze. Eddie shouted out into the dark, demanding whoever was there to show themselves, his voice cracking at the edges. Silence answered him. We should have left then. God, I wish we had. But something rooted us there, curiosity maybe, or pride. The night felt heavy, pressing down on us, and for reasons I still can't explain, we stayed. When it happened again, it was closer. Another splash, this time just a few yards from shore, followed by water lapping gently, rhythmically, like something moving closer. We all stood there, frozen, watching the black water as if it might explain itself. That's when Lisa screamed. Her voice split the night, raw and panicked, and she pointed at the surface of the water. At first, I couldn't see it, but then, just at the edge of the moonlight's reach, something pale broke the surface. It was the shape of a head, smooth, hairless, and impossibly white, rising just high enough for dark holes where eyes should have been to stare directly at us. Then it was gone, slipping beneath the surface without a sound. The next few minutes were chaos. Eddie grabbed the cooler and bolted for the trail. Lisa was crying, nearly hysterical, and Matt kept muttering, "We have to go, we have to go," under his breath like a mantra. I grabbed our blankets without thinking and followed them, heart pounding so hard I thought I might collapse. The trail back to the truck felt a mile long, branches scratching at our arms, every shadow twisting into something alive. Behind us, I swore I could hear wet, slapping footsteps on the gravel, though every time I looked back, there was nothing but darkness. We made it to the truck, piling in with trembling hands. Eddie fumbled the keys, dropping them once, twice, before finally jamming them into the ignition. The Chevy roared to life, and he tore out of there so fast the tires spit gravel like bullets. None of us spoke on the drive back, too terrified to put into words what we'd seen. When I got home that night, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that pale face in the water, those empty black holes staring at me. For weeks afterward, I avoided the quarry, avoided even driving down that stretch of road. Lisa refused to talk about it at all, shutting down anytime someone mentioned that night. Eddie laughed it off, though his laughter was too loud, too forced. Matt changed the most. He stopped hanging out, stopped answering calls, and eventually moved to live with his uncle in another state. But sometimes, late at night when the world is quiet, I swear I still hear it. That slow, wet breathing, close enough that it feels like someone's standing right behind me. And I wonder what would have happened if we hadn't left when we did. Story the end. It was one of those summer nights when the heat never really broke, even after the sun went down. The air was thick and sticky, like you could drink it, and the chorus of cicadas and crickets never seemed to stop. I was 21 that year, back home in a small town in central Kentucky after my second year of college. Summers there always felt both comforting and unsettling, like the stillness of the countryside made you more aware of everything that didn't feel quite right. I had a tight circle of friends I'd grown up with, and that night, like so many others, we were just trying to pass the time without losing our minds to boredom. We'd gathered at Marcus's house on the outskirts of town. His place was the kind of property that had been in his family forever, tucked away at the end of a long gravel road surrounded by acres of woods and cornfields. His parents were out of town for the week, so naturally it became our hangout spot. There were 5 of us: me, Marcus, his cousin Dylan, my friend Leah, and a girl I didn't know too well named Rachel, who Leah had invited along. We had a cooler full of cheap beer, a Bluetooth speaker, and nothing better to do than sit on the back porch and shoot the breeze. Around 10, after the last streaks of twilight had faded into a heavy darkness, Dylan suggested we go for a walk. He was always the one pushing for something more exciting, the kind of guy who couldn't sit still when there was a chance to make the night memorable. He wanted to cut through the woods, head toward an abandoned barn that we all knew about, but never really went near after dark. It wasn't far, maybe a half-mile through the trees, down a barely visible trail that the local kids used when they wanted to sneak cigarettes or hide from their parents. Marcus rolled his eyes but agreed, and Leah was already slipping her shoes back on before anyone else had the chance to object. I didn't want to be the one to look lame, so I said fine too. Rachel hesitated but followed the group. The woods at night in summer are something different than in the day. You feel them pressing in on you, the branches low and heavy, the smell of damp earth mixing with honeysuckle, and the faint ammonia scent of deer. Fireflies blinked around us, but their little flashes weren't enough to push back the blackness. Marcus carried a flashlight, its beam slicing through the trees like a sword, but every time he turned it away, the shadows seemed to close right back in. We followed Dylan, who knew the trail by heart. He kept up a steady pace, turning every so often to grin at us. "You guys are going to freak out when you see this place at night," he said. "It's creepy as hell." The barn sat in the middle of an overgrown clearing. Even from a distance, it looked wrong. Its roof sagging, boards weathered to a gray that almost glowed under the half moon, tall grass swallowing the lower walls. I'd seen it in daylight before, driving past on the road that curved nearby, but in the dark it looked almost alive, hunched like some animal waiting for us to get closer. Leah laughed nervously and grabbed my arm. "Why does it look like it's leaning toward us?" she whispered. "Because it's falling apart," I said, trying to sound casual, though my stomach was already tightening. Dylan marched straight up to the barn door, which hung crooked on rusted hinges. He shoved it with his shoulder, and the wood groaned in protest before giving way. The smell that rolled out was suffocating. Mold, damp hay, and something sour I couldn't quite place. Inside, the flashlight beam revealed the remnants of farm life long gone. A rusted plow leaned against the far wall, hay bales collapsed into piles of dust, broken ladders leading to a loft that looked like it would collapse under the weight of a squirrel. Cobwebs shimmered like silver threads in the light, and the air was thick, still, and heavy. "Bet none of you'll go up to the loft," Dylan said, pointing upward. "Bet none of us are stupid enough to," Marcus muttered. Leah giggled but stayed close to me. Rachel, who had been quiet most of the night, finally spoke up. "I don't like this place," she said softly. "Feels wrong." We should have listened. Dylan went first, climbing the ladder despite the creaks and groans it made. His weight stirred up dust that rained down on us. "Come on," he called. "There's old stuff up here." Marcus sighed and followed. I didn't want to, but Leah tugged at my arm, and I reluctantly went up too. The loft was worse than the ground floor. It stretched across the barn, but the boards were uneven and rotten in places. The smell was stronger up there, almost rancid. We picked our way across carefully, the flashlight beam catching on piles of junk, an old trunk, broken tools, and scraps of fabric that looked too much like clothes. Rachel stayed below, hugging herself as she looked around nervously. I remember clearly the way her eyes darted to the corners, like she was seeing something none of us did. "Look at this," Dylan said, kicking at the trunk until the lid cracked open. Inside were what looked like children's toys, wooden blocks, a stuffed rabbit with one ear missing, and a cracked porcelain doll face that made my skin crawl. "That's messed up," Leah whispered. "Why would that be up here?" Before anyone could answer, Marcus's flashlight flickered. Once, twice, then went out completely, plunging us into thick darkness. The silence that followed was immediate and suffocating, broken only by our own breaths. "Marcus," Dylan hissed, "quit screwing around." "I'm not," Marcus snapped back, his voice unsteady. We scrambled for our phones, but the signal was weak, and none of the screens seemed to want to stay lit. Mine kept glitching, the light pulsing faintly before dying again. Then we heard it. From below us came the sound of footsteps, slow, deliberate, crunching on straw and broken wood. At first, I thought it had to be Rachel moving around, but when I called her name, she didn't answer. The footsteps stopped, and the silence pressed harder against my ears. Leah's hand gripped mine so tightly I could feel her nails digging in. Dylan cursed under his breath. Then the footsteps started again, this time moving closer to the base of the ladder. "Rachel?" Marcus called, his voice trembling. No answer. We didn't breathe. I swear I could hear the blood rushing in my ears. Then, faintly, Rachel's voice came from outside the barn. "Guys? Can we leave? Please?" We froze. She was outside, but something was inside with us. The footsteps scraped right against the ladder now, slow and heavy, like whoever or whatever it was knew we were trapped above. Marcus finally managed to get the flashlight working again. He shone it down and there was nothing. The barn floor was empty, but the ladder was shaking. We didn't think. We ran, stumbling across the loft and half sliding, half falling down the ladder. The second my feet hit the ground, I grabbed Leia and bolted toward the doorway. Rachel stood outside in the clearing, her face pale in the moonlight. "What the hell?" Marcus yelled, shoving past us. "If you're out here, then who?" He stopped himself as if saying it out loud would make it real. We didn't go back to Marcus's porch. We didn't even slow down until we were halfway down the gravel road toward town, sweat soaking our shirts and our lungs burning from running. Nobody spoke for a long time. When we finally did, no one could explain what we'd heard or why Rachel had been outside while something moved around inside with us. That night stuck with me. It wasn't just the barn or the footsteps or the toys in the trunk. It was the way the woods seemed to swallow the sound of our voices, the way our lights refused to work, the way the air felt alive in that loft. I still don't know what was there or if it ever left. We never went back to that barn again. Marcus swore he'd never set foot on that trail after dark. Dylan joked about it for weeks, but I could see in his eyes he wasn't really laughing. Leah refused to talk about it at all. And Rachel, she moved away before summer ended. Sometimes, on hot nights when the cicadas are screaming and the air feels heavy enough to choke on, I think back to that summer night. I hear the footsteps on the barn floor, steady and patient. I wonder if whoever or whatever it was is still waiting out there, listening for someone stupid enough to come back. Story the end. The summer night was heavy, the kind that pressed down on you and made the air feel like it was thick with something other than heat. I remember it so clearly because of how ordinary it began, how simple it felt at first. It was late July, and the sun had dropped behind the line of trees that bordered our small Midwestern town. I was 22 at the time, just out of college for the summer and back home staying at my parents' house. My two closest friends, Mark and Jason, had both stayed in town as well. Mark was working construction with his uncle, and Jason was picking up shifts at the gas station off the main highway. None of us had a lot going on, so our nights were usually filled with the same routine. Grab some beers, find a spot to sit, and talk until the hours blended together. That particular night, Jason suggested driving out to the lake. It was about 15 miles outside of town, tucked behind an overgrown road that was barely lit, and we all agreed without hesitation. That lake had been our summer escape since we were kids. We swam there, camped there, and even as we got older, it became our spot to just get away from everything. The water wasn't really clean and the area wasn't well maintained, but it was isolated, quiet, and ours. We piled into Jason's car just before 10, a beat-up Pontiac with one headlight dimmer than the other. The drive itself wasn't long, but the farther we went, the more the night seemed to swallow us. Streetlights disappeared after the first few miles, leaving only the dull glow of the dashboard lights and the beams from our headlights cutting into the black. Fields stretched out on either side, and the occasional farmhouse sat like a dark, silent shadow against the horizon. Mark had the cooler wedged between his feet in the back seat, already cracking open a beer before we even left the edge of town. He handed me one when I turned to grab it, and the cold condensation felt good against my hand in the humid night air. Jason drove with his window cracked, letting in the thick summer air, and none of us said much as we rolled down those back roads. The silence wasn't uncomfortable. It was just the kind of silence you slipped into with people you'd known most of your life. When we finally pulled off the main road, Jason slowed the car to a crawl. The turnoff to the lake wasn't marked, just a dirt trail through the trees that you'd miss if you didn't know where to look. The car jolted as it went over rocks and dips, branches scraping along the side like nails dragging on metal. We'd driven that way hundreds of times, but every time it felt like we were entering another world, one cut off from the town we left behind. We parked in the usual clearing, a rough patch of dirt that had probably been carved out decades ago by kids like us. The lake wasn't visible from the car, but you could hear the faint lap of water if the night was quiet enough. When we got out, the air was still, the kind of stillness that almost felt staged. No wind, no chirping of crickets, not even the distant hum of farm equipment or passing cars. It was just heavy silence, broken only by the crunch of our footsteps as we carried the cooler and a couple of old folding chairs toward the water. The lake stretched out before us, dark and endless, reflecting only a sliver of moonlight that broke through the clouds. It wasn't big, but at night it looked infinite, like the black water went on forever. We set our stuff down near the edge, the same spot we always did, where the ground sloped gently toward the water and the dirt flattened enough to sit comfortably. Jason pulled out a flashlight, setting it upright so the beam pointed skyward, casting a dim glow over us. It wasn't much light, but enough to make the space feel less swallowed by the night. We sat, cracked open beers, and started talking about nothing in particular. Work, old memories, plans for the fall. Time slipped by quickly, as it always did, and at some point, Mark got the idea to go swimming. I wasn't eager. Swimming at night always felt wrong to me, but Jason shrugged, stripped down to his shorts, and waded in. Mark followed, splashing loudly, their laughter echoing across the water. I stayed on the shore, sipping my beer and keeping my eyes on the rippling black surface. It wasn't fear exactly, just an unease I couldn't shake. The lake at night was different. The shadows were deeper, the water darker, and you couldn't see more than a foot below the surface. I told myself it was just nerves, that I was being paranoid, but something about the quiet pressed harder on me than usual. After a few minutes, Mark shouted something and dove under, not resurfacing for several long seconds. Jason called out, laughing at first, but then his tone changed. He swam closer, looking around, before Mark finally burst back up, gasping and laughing like it was the funniest thing in the world. Jason cursed at him, and I felt my chest unclench, realizing I'd been holding my breath. They swam around for a while, splashing and daring each other to go farther out into the dark water. I tried to relax, but my eyes kept wandering back toward the tree line, where the woods loomed over us like a wall. The shadows between the trees looked darker than they should have been, like they were swallowing the little bit of moonlight. Every time I thought I saw movement, I told myself it was just the breeze shifting branches, though I couldn't hear a breeze. It must have been close to midnight when Jason came back to shore, dripping wet and grinning, collapsing into one of the folding chairs. Mark stayed out a little longer, floating on his back, staring up at the sky. Jason and I started talking again, quieter this time, and that's when I noticed it. The silence. Not just a lack of crickets or frogs, but something heavier. It was like the entire night had muted itself, as though even the water lapping against the shore had stopped. Jason noticed it too, pausing mid-sentence, his brow furrowing as he looked toward the woods. The flashlight's beam flickered slightly, and I felt my stomach knot. Mark swam back quickly after Jason called out to him, climbing out of the water and rubbing his arms like he felt the same chill I did. We all sat there, scanning the tree line, waiting for some normal sound to break the tension. Nothing did. Then we heard it. Footsteps. Not animals scurrying, not branches snapping randomly, but heavy, deliberate footsteps. They came from the direction of the trees, slow at first, then stopping abruptly. We all froze, staring at the darkness just beyond where the flashlight reached. Jason called out, his voice cracking slightly, "Who's there?" No response. Mark, always the one to mask fear with anger, shouted louder, louder, telling whoever it was to come out. Again, silence. Then the footsteps started again, closer this time, crunching against the underbrush. I felt my skin crawl as I realized it wasn't just footsteps, it sounded like more than one. At least two, maybe three sets, moving in uneven rhythm. Jason grabbed the flashlight, shining it toward the trees, but the beam only reached so far before the darkness swallowed it. For a moment, I swore I saw shapes, tall, human-like, standing just at the edge of sight. But as soon as I blinked, they were gone. Mark picked up a broken branch from the ground, holding it like a weapon, muttering under his breath. Jason whispered that we should leave, and for once, I agreed completely. We packed up hastily, tossing the chairs and half-empty cooler into the car, all the while listening to those footsteps circling closer, sometimes fading, sometimes reappearing, like whoever or whatever it was trying to hurt us. When we finally got into the car, Jason fumbled with the keys, his hands shaking. The headlights cut on, illuminating the trees in front of us, and that's when we saw them. 3 figures, standing at the edge of the woods. They weren't moving, just standing there, too far for us to make out details, but close enough to know they were watching us. My chest tightened as Jason slammed the car into reverse, like spinning us around on the dirt and speeding down the trail. The branches clawed at the sides of the car, the undercarriage scraping against rocks as we tore out of there, faster than we ever had before. No one spoke for miles. Not until the glow of town lights finally appeared on the horizon. Even then, we sat in silence, breathing heavily, each of us trying to process what had happened. When Jason finally spoke, his voice was low, almost as if he was afraid someone would overhear. They were waiting for us. None of us argued. We didn't go back to the lake that summer. Not that summer or any after. But the strangest thing? A week later, when I was driving alone past the old road to the lake, I glanced down it without thinking. At the tree line, in the fading light of dusk, I saw one of them. Standing perfectly still, watching. I didn't stop. I didn't slow down. I just kept driving, the hairs on the back of my neck standing straight up the entire way home. And sometimes on summer nights like this, when the air is still and the world feels too quiet, I swear I hear those footsteps again, circling closer in the dark. Story the end. The summer nights where I grew up in Ohio had a very particular atmosphere. The air held on to the day's heat like a damp blanket. Crickets sang their endless chorus, and the streets seemed quieter than they should have been, as though everyone knew to stay inside once the sun went down. I was 17 that summer, just old enough to think I could handle being out late without any real fear, but still young enough to not fully understand what real danger looked like. I thought the scariest things on a summer night were mosquitoes, drunk drivers, or maybe getting caught sneaking back in after curfew. I didn't realize that something far stranger, far darker, could creep into an otherwise ordinary night. It started with a group of us sitting around a bonfire at my friend Jacob's house. His family had a little land just outside of town, enough that the fire crackled in the middle of his backyard without the neighbors caring about the smoke. There were 6 of us there. Me, Jacob, his girlfriend Amber, a kid named Ryan. I didn't know all that well, my best friend Kyle, and this quiet girl named Sarah, who usually just listened more than she spoke. We had music playing low from someone's phone, cheap soda and snacks scattered around, and the glow of the fire painted all of our faces in that warm, flickering orange. It was one of those nights where nothing in particular was happening, but it felt good just to be out there, feeling like the world was a little bigger and we were part of it. It was around 11 when Kyle suggested we walk down to the old railroad tracks. They weren't in use anymore, just a stretch of rusted rails and weeds that cut through the woods behind Jacob's property. Everyone knew the tracks had a weird reputation. Kids at school swapped stories about them being haunted, about people hearing voices if they walked there at night. Nothing ever seemed proven, just small-town folklore, the kind of thing teenagers use to spook each other. Jacob laughed at the idea, but Amber didn't look thrilled. She said she didn't like the tracks, that they gave her the creeps even during the day. Ryan and Kyle teased her for being scared, and before long, everyone was on their feet, ready to go. I didn't want to look like the only one backing out, so I went along too. The path through the woods wasn't long, but at night it felt endless. The moonlight barely made it through the thick trees, and the air seemed heavier, quieter, like the crickets didn't follow us past the backyard. Jacob led the way with a flashlight, and the rest of us stayed close behind. I could hear Amber whispering to him, telling him this was a bad idea, but he just squeezed her hand and kept walking. The smell of damp earth and leaves filled the air, and every now and then a twig would snap under someone's shoe, making all of us flinch just a little. It didn't feel like a fun adventure anymore. It felt like we were trespassing somewhere we weren't supposed to be. When we reached the tracks, the trees opened up and the sky stretched wide above us. The moon hung low, bright enough that the rails gleamed silver in places, cutting a line straight into the distance. On either side, tall weeds swayed in the breeze, and somewhere far off a dog barked. I remember thinking it looked almost beautiful in a strange way. We stood there for a while, just listening to the silence, the flashlight beam sweeping across gravel and rust. Then Kyle grinned and said, "Let's walk it." He meant the old game of balancing on the rail, seeing who could go the farthest without falling off. It sounded harmless, and after the tense walk through the woods, it almost felt like a relief. One by one, we tried it. Kyle made it the farthest, arms out like a tightrope walker, before stumbling off and laughing. Even Amber tried for a few steps before hopping down nervously. Sarah didn't try at all. She just stood near the edge of the weeds, her eyes fixed down the tracks like she was waiting for something. I noticed it, but didn't say anything. When it was my turn, I barely made it 3 steps before losing balance. The others laughed, and for a brief moment it felt like everything was normal again. That changed when Sarah suddenly spoke. Her voice was quiet, but sharp enough that we all froze. "Do you hear that?" she asked. At first, none of us did. The night was still, only the faint rustle of weeds and the distant dog. Then, slowly, I picked it up. A sound, faint, like a low hum. It wasn't the crickets or the breeze. It was deeper, almost like someone was singing far away. Jacob shone the flashlight down the tracks, but there was nothing there, just empty rails vanishing into the trees. The sound faded as soon as we tried to focus on it, slipping back into silence. We all stood there, listening, our breathing louder than anything else. Amber grabbed Jacob's arm and said she wanted to leave. Ryan muttered something about it probably just being the wind, but he didn't sound convinced. Then we heard it again, clearer this time. A voice. Not singing exactly, more like humming, low and steady, carrying on the air. It came from further down the tracks in the direction where the rails disappeared into the dark. Every hair on my arm stood up. It wasn't close, but it wasn't far either, and the way it carried made it impossible to tell how far the source actually was. Kyle, trying to play it off, shouted, "Hello." His voice cracked slightly, betraying the nerves behind his grin. The humming stopped instantly. The silence that followed felt crushing. No breeze, no crickets, just us and the dark. I felt my chest tighten like the air had gotten heavier. Then, after a long pause, we heard it again. Not humming this time, but words. A voice, low and hoarse, carried down the tracks. "Come closer." Amber screamed. Jacob pulled her back, holding the flashlight tighter, the beam shaking as his hand trembled. "Who's there?" he called, but his voice wasn't nearly as confident as Kyle's had been. No one answered. The weeds around us rustled, though there was no wind. I could feel my own heartbeat in my throat, the kind of fear that makes your legs itch to run, even when you don't know where to. Sarah was the only one who didn't look panicked. She was staring down the tracks, her face pale, her lips moving like she was whispering something under her breath. I stepped closer to her and asked what she was saying, but she didn't answer. She just lifted a hand and pointed. In the distance, where the moonlight barely touched the rails, there was movement. A figure, standing on the tracks. It was far, too far to make out clearly, but I could see the outline of someone tall, unmoving, watching us. The flashlight beam couldn't reach that far, but the silhouette was unmistakable. My stomach dropped. Ryan swore under his breath and stepped back, his sneakers crunching on gravel. "That's it, I'm out," he said. "I'm not sticking around for this." Amber begged Jacob to leave too, tugging on his arm. For once, Jacob didn't argue. He just nodded, his jaw tight, and turned toward the woods. But when he aimed the flashlight back to the path we'd come from, the beam caught something else, another figure. standing just at the tree line. Closer. It didn't move, didn't speak, just stood there, half hidden in shadow, like it had been waiting for us to turn around. The sight of it sent a cold rush through me, so strong I nearly stumbled. We were trapped, one figure ahead on the tracks, another blocking the path back. None of us spoke at first, too stunned, too afraid to even breathe. Then the voice came again, but this time it wasn't distant. It was close, right behind us. "Come closer," Amber screamed again, and that broke whatever frozen grip we'd been under. Everyone bolted at once, scattering off the tracks into the weeds, pushing through the brush in any direction that wasn't toward those figures. The branches clawed at my arms as I ran, the flashlight beam swinging wildly before vanishing when Jacob dropped it in the scramble. I could hear Kyle ahead of me, shouting my name, but I didn't dare slow down. My lungs burned, my legs ached, but fear pushed me harder than anything ever had. I don't know how long we ran before we burst out of the trees and stumbled back into Jacob's yard. The bonfire had burned low, just glowing embers now, and the sudden familiarity of the place almost made me collapse with relief. One by one, the others came crashing out of the woods, gasping, crying, their faces pale and scratched. Amber was sobbing into Jacob's chest, Ryan was bent over retching into the grass, and Kyle grabbed my shoulders, asking if I'd seen them, if I'd seen how close they were. Sarah was the last to emerge. She walked, not ran, her clothes torn from the branches, but her face strangely calm. When she reached the yard, she looked at us with that same quiet expression and said, almost casually, "They weren't after us. Not yet." That night ended with us huddled in Jacob's living room, all the lights on, no one daring to speak of what we'd actually seen. Ryan called his brother to come pick him up. Amber refused to leave Jacob's side, shaking at every noise outside. Kyle tried to make jokes but couldn't keep the fear out of his voice. And Sarah just sat there, staring out the window at the woods like she was waiting for something else to happen. I didn't sleep at all. None of us did. The humming never returned, and when the sun rose, it felt almost like it could have been a dream. But the scratches on my arms, the lost flashlight, the way Amber's voice broke every time she tried to talk about it, it was real. Too real. The following day, Jacob went back to look for the flashlight. He swore the tracks were empty, no footprints but ours, no sign of anyone else. But he didn't find the flashlight either. It was just gone. None of us ever walked that way again. Even years later, whenever I hear humming in the distance on a summer night, I feel that same cold rush in my chest, and I remember the figures, silent, waiting, and the voice that whispered for us to come closer. Story, the end. The night was warm and thick with the kind of humidity that wraps around you like a heavy blanket, making it almost impossible to breathe deeply. It was late July in a small town somewhere in the Midwest, the kind of place where summer nights seemed endless, and the cicadas' chorus echoed through the thick, still air. I had just graduated high school and was home for the summer before college, spending my evenings on the front porch or wandering the streets with friends until well past midnight. But that night, the night I'm about to tell you about, was different. It changed how I saw those warm summer evenings forever. I remember it started just like any other night. The sky was clear, stars bright and scattered above like spilled glitter, and the air carried that faint scent of cut grass mixed with the sweet, sharp tang of honeysuckle. My friend Jake and I were sitting on the edge of the local park near the creek that cut through the outskirts of town, drinking cheap beer from green glass bottles. We had plans to meet a few other friends later, but we were just killing time, talking about nothing in particular. The usual summer night banter about music, girls, and what we might do once we left this town. The park was quiet, save for the rustling of the leaves and the distant hoot of an owl. The streetlights along the road leading to the park flickered faintly, casting long, wavering shadows that danced with the breeze. It was the kind of night that felt alive but sleepy, like the world was holding its breath. Jake and I had just settled into a comfortable silence when I heard it. Soft footsteps, almost like a shuffle, coming from the dense woods that bordered the park. At first, I thought it might be an animal, maybe a raccoon or something small moving through the underbrush, but the sound was too deliberate, too rhythmic, like someone pacing or walking slowly. "Did you hear that?" I asked, nudging Jake with my elbow. He nodded, eyes narrowing into the shadows. Probably just some kid messing around. This place gets weird at night. I wasn't so sure. The footsteps stopped suddenly, replaced by a low, breathy sound, almost a whisper, but not quite human. It was like a soft chant, a series of quiet syllables I couldn't understand. I felt a chill despite the heat pressing on my skin. Maybe we should head back, I said, standing up, suddenly uneasy. Jake grinned, brushing it off. Nah, you're just spooked. It's probably nothing. We started walking back toward the street, but the feeling that we were being watched was thick, like the night itself was closing in around us. The whispering sound rose and fell, almost like someone breathing in a strange rhythm, always just out of sight. As we reached the edge of the park near the old abandoned lot that used to be a gas station before it burned down years ago, something else caught my eye. A faint flicker of light in the distance, near the tree line. It wasn't a flashlight or a campfire, but more like a pale bluish glow that seemed to pulse softly like a heartbeat. Did you see that? I asked, pointing toward the light. Jake squinted, his face suddenly serious. Yeah. What the hell? We both stared, frozen for a moment as the glow grew brighter, shifting slowly between shades of blue and white. Then, without warning, it vanished entirely. I wanted to call out, to see if anyone was there, but my voice caught in my throat. The silence that followed was oppressive, almost suffocating. We quickened our pace toward the street, eager to leave the park behind. Back at Jake's house, we tried to laugh it off, but neither of us could shake the feeling that something was wrong, that something had been there, watching us. That night, when I got home, I couldn't sleep. I lay awake, staring at the ceiling fan spinning lazily above me, ears straining for any sound beyond the usual night noises. Then I heard it, the whispering again, faint and urgent, drifting through the open window. It wasn't in any language I recognized, but it seemed to call out to me, beckoning from the darkness. I closed the window and pulled the covers over my head, heart pounding. The rest of the summer was a blur of uneasy nights and strange sightings. Shadows flickered at the edges of my vision, lights appeared and disappeared in the woods, and the whispering followed me wherever I went. When school started again in the fall, I told Jake I didn't want to talk about that summer anymore. Some things, I said, were better left forgotten. But every so often, when the air turns heavy and the cicadas begin their song, I swear I hear that whispering again just beneath the wind, waiting for me to listen. Story the end. That summer was one of those rare ones where the heat felt oppressive every single night, thick enough to taste in the air. We lived in a small town in the Midwest, not much more than a scattering of houses around a dusty main street with cornfields stretching out beyond the edges of town. By late July, the days melted into one another, and the nights did little to cool things off. It was the kind of summer where the cicadas never really stopped buzzing, and the lightning bugs blinked lazily in the humidity. I was 17, on the cusp of that restless age when the days blur into nights and boredom is a heavy, unbearable thing. My best friends and I, Jake, Emma, and me, had no plans one Friday night, so we decided to go to Miller's Pond. It was a place about a 10-minute bike ride from my house. Miller's Pond was one of those local spots everyone knew about, but no one talked about too much because it wasn't exactly official. It was a natural pond with a small dirt parking lot, a rickety dock, and a few picnic tables scattered around. It was the kind of place teenagers went to when they wanted to get away from parents and curfews and all the small rules of small-town life. We got there around 9, the sky still glowing a dull orange in the west as the sun set. The pond's surface was still reflecting the streaks of clouds overhead. Emma was the first to suggest we swim. The water was murky near the edges but clearer in the middle, cool and inviting under the thick heat of the day. We all jumped in, splashing and yelling, the sound of our laughter cutting through the quiet evening air. It was perfect, until about an hour later when the first strange thing happened. We were sitting on the dock drying off, talking about nothing important, when Jake pointed at the far side of the pond. "Hey, what's that over there?" At first, I didn't see anything. Just the tree line framing the water, the tall pines swaying gently in the breeze. But then Emma leaned closer, squinting. "There's a light," she said softly. "Like a flashlight or something. Someone's there." I felt a chill run through me, but I forced it down. We were just kids, and maybe someone was camping or fishing late. Probably some older guys, I said, though I wasn't sure I believed it. Jake grabbed his phone and tried to zoom in, but the screen was grainy. The light was definitely moving slowly, a dim white dot weaving through the trees on the far shore. Maybe we should call it a night, Emma said, suddenly tense. I noticed her voice was shaking a little. Nah, Jake said, grinning. We're not babies. Let's just keep an eye on it. For the next 20 minutes, the light moved closer, creeping along the edge of the water. We started to get nervous. I told myself it was probably a hiker or someone lost, but then I heard a noise from the woods behind us, a snap of a branch, low and deliberate. Did you hear that? Emma whispered. Jake laughed, a little too loudly. Probably a raccoon. We tried to brush it off, but the sound came again, closer this time. A heavy footstep, another snap. I felt my pulse quicken. I wanted to get up and leave, but Jake was frozen, staring hard at the trees. Suddenly, the flashlight beam flashed toward us, bright and harsh. We ducked behind the dock's railing, trying not to scream. The light swung slowly back and forth, scanning the water's surface. "Who's there?" Jake called out, voice cracking slightly. No answer, just the beam flickering again. Then it stopped, pointed directly at us. I could feel my skin crawl. The figure holding the flashlight was still just at the tree line, but now we could see more. An outline of a tall man wearing what looked like a wide-brimmed hat and a long coat. "Let's go," Emma said, pulling at my arm. Jake hesitated, eyes fixed on the man. Without warning, the man stepped off into the clearing, and we saw his face. A gaunt, pale face with deep-set eyes that gleamed in the flashlight's glow. We didn't wait to see more. Emma grabbed Jake's bike and pushed it hard, yelling at me to come on. We scrambled up the bank, sprinted toward the parking lot, and jumped on our bikes. The night air felt cooler as we pedaled away, but I couldn't shake the feeling of eyes on my back. Behind us, I could swear I heard footsteps pounding after us, crunching on the gravel. We didn't stop until we reached the streetlights near Emma's house, where the glow of her porch light felt like safety itself. We called the police, but when they came out the next day to check, there was no sign of anyone. No footprints, no campfire, nothing. Just the still pond and the rustling trees. That night, I lay awake, listening to the sounds outside my window, the crickets, the distant train whistle, and the knowledge that someone had been watching us from the shadows. The summer stretched on, but I never went back to Miller's Pond after dark. Story, the end. The sun had barely set over the small town of Pine Ridge, Ohio, but the heat from the day still lingered, pressing down on everything like a thick blanket. Summer nights here were supposed to be peaceful, filled with the low hum of crickets and the occasional flicker of fireflies in the darkening fields. But that night in late July, something was different. Something that would change the way I saw those long, slow summers forever. I was 22, just out of my junior year of college, home for the summer break. Like most people my age in Pine Ridge, my friends and I spent those nights looking for anything to break the monotony. The old fairgrounds on the edge of town had been shut down for years, but it was a popular spot for us. Big open fields, an old abandoned carousel that still groaned in the wind, and plenty of places to hide or explore after dark. The fairgrounds were technically off-limits, fenced and marked, but no one cared much. We all knew the cops wouldn't bother chasing us out unless we were causing trouble. That evening, I was hanging out with my friend Matt and a couple of others, Jason and Ellie. We had all met at college, but during the summer, it was like the town had swallowed us up again, everyone drifting back home but itching for something to do. Matt suggested we check out the fairgrounds, as usual, and I agreed, partly because I wanted to see Ellie, who had recently started dating Jason. The tension between those two was obvious, and Matt teased them mercilessly. We drove out just after 9 p.m., the sun melting behind the trees, casting long shadows over the cracked asphalt and overgrown grass. The air was thick with humidity, and the smell of freshly cut hay mixed with distant campfire smoke. As we parked near the rusted entrance gate, the familiar creak of the carousel spinning slightly in the breeze greeted us. "Man, I swear this place gets creepier every year," Jason said, pulling a flashlight from his backpack. Ellie rolled her eyes. "Don't start with that haunted carnival nonsense." Matt grinned. "I'm telling you, this place is haunted. The old owner disappeared years ago. They say on hot summer nights like this, you can still hear the carousel music. We laughed and pushed our way through the weeds toward the carousel. Its paint was chipped, the horses frozen mid-gallop, eyes wide and glassy. I shone my flashlight around the circle, and the beam caught something on the ground, an old, faded ticket stub, curling at the edges. I picked it up and showed it to the others. "Guess someone was here not too long ago," I said, trying to sound casual. Ellie frowned, shoving her hands in her pockets. Maybe someone who didn't want to be seen. The mood shifted. None of us were exactly scared, but the air seemed heavier, like the summer heat had turned sticky in a way that wasn't natural. We moved on, exploring the stalls and the dilapidated games booths. The flickering neon signs buzzed faintly, some still working despite years of neglect. After a while, we settled near the old funhouse, where the broken mirrors twisted our reflections into grotesque shapes. Matt suggested we go inside, and Jason was all for it. Ellie hesitated, but followed anyway. Inside, the air was cooler, and the musty smell of mold and dust was strong. The floorboards creaked under our feet. We moved carefully, our flashlights casting long, jittery shadows against the warped walls. In one room, the mirrors were cracked, reflecting fragmented images back at us. I caught sight of something out of the corner of my eye, a figure standing just behind one of the mirrors, but when I turned to look, there was nothing there. "Did you guys see that?" I whispered. Matt laughed nervously. "It's just a trick of the light, man." We pressed deeper into the funhouse, laughter fading as a quiet unease settled over us. Then the air shifted, and the temperature dropped suddenly. My breath fogged in front of me, and I could hear a faint sound, a low, melodic tune, like the music box my grandmother used to play. Ellie stopped and looked around, her eyes wide. "Do you guys hear that?" Jason nodded, looking unsettled. "Yeah. Where's it coming from?" We followed the sound to a small door at the back of the funhouse. It was partially open, revealing a narrow staircase leading down into darkness. "Should we go down?" Ellie asked, voice barely above a whisper. Matt shrugged, trying to sound brave. "Why not? Could be something cool." We descended carefully, the music growing louder, echoing off the stone walls. The stairs opened into a basement room, lit only by a flickering bulb overhead. In the center of the room was an old music box, spinning slowly on a dusty table. The tune was sweet and haunting, filling the space with an eerie calm. Jason reached out to touch it, but as soon as his fingers brushed the surface, the music stopped. The silence was sudden and suffocating. Then, from somewhere deeper in the shadows, a voice whispered, "Why have you come?" We froze. The voice was barely audible, like a breath, but it was there. None of us answered. The room grew colder still, and the light bulb flickered wildly. Shapes moved in the corners of our vision, shadows that didn't belong to any of us. Panic began to rise. "I think we should get out of here," I said, stepping backward. Matt nodded quickly, grabbing my arm. "Yeah, now." We scrambled up the stairs, bursting out into the night air. The oppressive heat was back, but the weight of that basement still clung to us. We ran toward the cars without looking back. That should have been the scariest part. But it wasn't. Over the next few nights, strange things began happening. Ellie called me the day after our visit, her voice shaky. "I keep hearing that music box song," she said. "Even when I'm at home, it's playing in my head." Jason started having nightmares. Vivid, terrifying dreams of being trapped in that basement, chased by unseen hands. Matt complained of feeling watched, hearing footsteps behind him when he was alone. I thought I was imagining it all until one night, about a week later, I was lying in bed when I heard it too. That music, faint and distant, coming from somewhere outside my window. I live on the edge of town, with nothing but woods behind the house. I grabbed a flashlight and crept outside, heart pounding. The song stopped as soon as I stepped into the yard. I turned to go back inside when I saw it, a pale figure standing at the edge of the trees, face obscured, eyes glowing faintly. I froze, breath catching in my throat. It didn't move, didn't blink, just stared. Then, slowly, it began to walk toward me. I ran inside and locked the door, but the feeling of being watched never left me. Over the following weeks, all of us in that group experienced more and more strange occurrences. Doors slamming shut, whispers in empty rooms, shadows moving just beyond sight. Ellie moved away, unable to handle it anymore. Jason dropped out of school, too terrified to stay. Matt refused to talk about it, and I tried to convince myself it was all in our heads. Stress, overactive imaginations fueled by the creepiness of the fairgrounds. But I know the truth. That summer night at the fairgrounds wasn't just a stupid teenage adventure gone wrong. We stumbled into something old and angry, something that wanted us to hear its song, to remember its story. And sometimes, when the summer wind blows just right, I still hear the music box playing, calling me back to that dark basement where the shadows wait. Story the end. The summer night was heavy and thick with humidity, the kind that made every breath feel like you were inhaling warm syrup. It was late July in rural Kentucky, and the kind of heat that settled into your skin, refusing to leave even after the sun sank below the horizon. I was 23, home for the summer from college, and restless in a way I hadn't felt before. The town I grew up in was small and sleepy, the kind of place where everyone knew your name, but nobody really talked about the strange things that sometimes happen just beyond the edge of the woods. My two closest friends, Mike and Sarah, and I had spent the day hanging out by the creek near the old Miller farm, an abandoned property just on the outskirts of town. That evening, after the sun had fully disappeared and the sky had turned a deep velvet, we decided to take a walk through the woods to clear our heads. Mike had always been the adventurous one, always wanting to push the boundaries of what was safe or sane. Sarah was cautious, but usually went along with whatever the guys wanted. We set out around 10 p.m., the only light coming from the crescent moon hanging low between the tree branches and the faint glow of fireflies flickering through the underbrush. The woods were thick and dense, the smell of damp earth and decaying leaves rising up in the humid air. The only sounds were our footsteps on the soft ground and the occasional distant call of an owl. We made our way to an old logging road that cut through the forest, a path none of us had taken in years. Mike had mentioned hearing rumors about strange things happening out there. Lights flickering in the trees, voices carried on the wind, shadows that moved without cause. We joked about it, trying to shake off the unease that had started to settle over me. As we walked, the temperature suddenly dropped. It was subtle at first, a slight chill that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. Then the sounds of the night seemed to hush, as if the forest was holding its breath. I glanced over at Mike and Sarah, noticing that they both looked uneasy too. Ahead of us, the narrow road curved sharply and disappeared behind a copse of trees. We slowed down, our flashlights barely penetrating the darkness. That's when we saw it, a flicker of movement in the shadows just beyond the tree line, something watching us. Mike tried to laugh it off, shining his light toward the spot, but there was nothing there. The air grew stiller, heavier. Then came the sound, a soft, rhythmic tapping, like someone tapping their fingernails on a hollow tree trunk. We froze. Sarah whispered that she wanted to turn back, but Mike insisted we keep going. The tapping grew louder, more insistent, echoing off the trees around us. I felt my heart pounding, sweat mixing with the sudden cold that had seeped through my clothes. Suddenly, from the darkness, a figure emerged. Pale, tall, and thin, it moved without making a sound, its eyes reflecting the flashlight beams like black pits. It didn't speak. It just stood there, watching. We turned and ran, branches whipping against our faces, the tapping echoing behind us until it abruptly stopped as we burst out of the woods onto the main road. We didn't stop running until we reached Mike's truck, where we locked the doors and sat shaking in silence. We never spoke of that night again, but I still wake up sometimes, heart racing, hearing that tapping in the dark. Story, the end. The night started like any other summer evening in my small hometown in Indiana. Warm, humid, with that sticky kind of heat that settles in your skin and refuses to let go. It was late July and the kind of night where the crickets chirp endlessly and the scent of freshly cut grass lingers long after the sun dips below the horizon. I was 16, the oldest of a group of 4 friends. Me, Jake, Melissa, and Carter, and we were all itching for some kind of adventure to break the monotony of our sleepy town. The local pool was closed for renovations, the movies had nothing new playing, and the usual summer fairs had ended weeks ago. Jake, who was always the daring one, suggested we explore the old Miller farm just outside town. The place had been abandoned for years, ever since Old Man Miller passed away. Rumors floated around that the house was haunted. that strange things had happened there and that it was best to stay away. Of course, none of us really believed any of it, but the idea of sneaking into a creepy deserted farmhouse on a summer night sounded thrilling. Perfect for a bunch of teenagers looking for a story to tell. So we planned it out. We'd meet at Jake's house around 10 p.m., bring flashlights, a couple of sodas, and some snacks. I was nervous, but I didn't want to be the one who chickened out. The four of us piled into Jake's beat-up pickup truck, and he drove us down the winding country roads until the old farm came into view, lit faintly by the soft glow of the nearly full moon. The house sat at the end of a long dirt driveway, surrounded by overgrown fields and the skeletal remains of what used to be a barn. The porch sagged, paint peeling off the weathered wood, windows dark and empty like hollow eyes. We parked the truck near the road and crept up the driveway on foot. The gravel crunched beneath our sneakers, loud in the otherwise silent night. My heart pounded, partly from excitement and partly from that primal fear of the unknown. Jake flicked on his flashlight, the beam cutting through the darkness and bouncing off the cracked window panes. "Ready?" he whispered, his voice barely audible. We all nodded. The front door was unlocked, surprisingly so. It creaked open with a long groan, revealing the house's dark interior. The air inside smelled of dust, mold, and something else, something faintly metallic and sharp. The floorboards beneath our feet moaned as we stepped inside. Our flashlights revealed peeling wallpaper, old furniture covered in sheets, and spiderwebs thick enough to trip over. We stuck together, moving slowly through the main hallway. Jake pulled out his phone, switching on the flashlight app to help illuminate the way. We made it to the living room, where an old grandfather clock stood frozen at 2:15. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the occasional creak and the sound of our breathing. Melissa joked nervously, "Maybe Old Man Miller is still here, watching us." We all laughed, but even our forced laughter sounded hollow. Then Carter, who had been lagging behind, suddenly stopped. "Guys, do you hear that?" We all paused, straining to listen. At first, nothing, then a faint tapping. Not the usual creak of an old house, but deliberate, like someone was knocking. "Where's that coming from?" I asked, my voice cracking. The tapping seemed to be coming from upstairs. Jake grinned. "Guess we're checking out the upstairs, then." We exchanged uneasy looks, but followed the narrow staircase up. The steps were covered in dust, and the railing was loose under our hands. The tapping grew louder as we ascended, rhythmic and steady. When we reached the top, the hallway stretched in front of us, lined with closed doors. The tapping stopped. "Great," Jake said. "Now what?" We started walking down the hall, shining our flashlights on the doors. Then, from the last door on the left, the one at the very end, came a soft thud, like something heavy falling. Melissa gasped. "No way." Jake approached the door slowly, hand outstretched. He turned the knob, and it opened with a squeak. The room inside was a child's bedroom. Old toys were scattered across the floor, a cracked dollhouse sat in the corner, and a small bed with a faded quilt lay against the wall. The moonlight streaming through the window gave the room a ghostly glow. Suddenly, the door slammed shut behind us with a deafening bang. We all jumped, whirling around. Jake fumbled with the handle, but the door was stuck, locked somehow from the outside. "Shit," he muttered. "We're trapped." Panic set in. We pounded on the door, shouting for help, but the silence outside was absolute. The house seemed to be holding its breath. Then from the corner of the room, the dollhouse's tiny door creaked open. We all turned to look. Inside the dollhouse, a miniature figure appeared. It was a little girl, dressed in an old-fashioned white dress, her face pale and expressionless. She didn't move, but her eyes seemed to follow us. Melissa whimpered. "This isn't funny, Jake." Jake shook his head. "I swear I'm not doing this." The figure in the dollhouse began to move, slowly turning its head from side to side. Then, in a voice barely louder than a whisper, it spoke. "Leave." The air grew colder. I could see our breaths forming in small clouds. Suddenly, the room's lights flickered. Shadows stretched along the walls, twisting and contorting into shapes that didn't belong. The dollhouse girl disappeared, but the feeling of being watched intensified. Then, the window slammed open, letting in a rush of cold air that scattered papers and old toys across the floor. Carter screamed and lunged for the door again, pounding with all his might. This time it gave way, and we spilled out into the hallway, gasping for air. We didn't stop running until we reached the front door and burst into the warm night outside. Back in Jake's truck, as we sped down the driveway and back toward town, none of us spoke. The silence was heavy, but the relief of fresh air and safety was overwhelming. The next day, we told a few people about what happened, but nobody believed us. Some laughed, others told us the house was dangerous and to stay away, but the story spread around school quickly enough. Still, for me, that night left a mark I can't explain. The chill in the summer air, the feeling that something else was there in that house, watching us, waiting. Weeks later, when I passed by the Miller farm during the day, the house looked just like any old abandoned place. But sometimes on a hot summer afternoon, I swear I see the silhouette of a little girl standing in the upstairs window, and I remember that whisper, "Leave." Story the end. It was one of those thick summer nights in mid-July when the air feels like a wet blanket and the streetlights glow hazy through the humid haze. I was 24, just finished with my first year of college, back home in a small town in Ohio for the summer. The kind of town where everyone knows your name, but nobody really knows your story, you know? My friends and I didn't have much planned that night, just the usual wandering around, killing time before the next day's shift at the diner. I was with my two closest friends, Mike and Sarah. We'd been tight since high school. Mike was the jokester, always cracking wise, and Sarah was the level-headed one, the type who kept us grounded. That night, we drove around in Mike's old pickup, windows down despite the heat, music low mostly to hear the crickets and cicadas that filled the night. Somewhere around 10:30, Mike suggested we head out to the river. There was this old fishing spot a few miles out of town, down a narrow dirt road flanked by thick woods. Not many people went out there anymore. Most of us had grown out of it. But that night, it felt like the right place to be, away from the noise of the town. The drive was quiet, except for the hum of the engine and the occasional crackle of the radio. The road narrowed as we got closer to the river, shadows from the trees swallowing us whole. Mike joked about the stories he'd heard growing up, the kind of local legends you hear when the sun goes down, about things in the woods no one talks about during the day. Sarah rolled her eyes but stayed quiet, and I was just watching the road and the dark shapes beyond the windshield. We reached the old parking spot, a small clearing barely big enough for Mike's truck. We climbed out, the night air heavy and thick. The only light was from the moon, just a sliver, but enough to cast a silver sheen over the river. We walked down the narrow path to the water's edge. The river was calm, almost eerily so, reflecting the dark sky above. We found some smooth stones and sat on the bank, skipping them across the water, listening to the night. That's when I noticed something. A faint movement just across the river, in the shadows where the trees crowded the bank. It looked like a figure, maybe a person, standing still. I nudged Mike and nodded toward it. He squinted but said it was probably just a tree branch or some wild animal, but Sarah looked uneasy. "Guys, I don't like this," she said softly. We decided to leave, but as we turned back, the air seemed to change. The temperature dropped and the night got quiet, too quiet. No insects chirping, no rustling leaves, just silence. That's when we heard it. Soft, wet footsteps crunching in the underbrush behind us. Slow and deliberate, we froze. "Did you hear that?" Sarah whispered, voice trembling. Mike grabbed a flashlight from the truck and shone it toward the trees, but nothing was there. The beam cut through the darkness, but the shadows didn't move. We quickened our pace back to the truck. The footsteps stopped. When we reached the parking spot, Mike started the engine, but as he shifted into reverse, the headlights caught something in the road. A figure, pale and still, standing between us and the dirt road. Mike slammed the brakes, heart pounding. The figure didn't move. No face, just a pale silhouette. Suddenly, the figure lunged forward, disappearing into the darkness on either side of the road. We sped off, not daring to look back until we reached the safety of the main highway. The rest of the summer, none of us talked about that night. But I still wake up sometimes, sweating, hearing those footsteps in the dark. Whatever it was waiting in those woods, just out of sight. Story the end. The summer of '98 was supposed to be the best one of my life. I was 18, freshly graduated from high school in a sleepy town in Ohio, and my friends and I were gearing up for those endless nights that only summer could bring. There was a freedom in those days, the kind that made you think nothing bad could ever happen. We were young, reckless, and convinced the world belonged to us. The night it all happened started like any other. Me, my best friend Jake, and two other friends, Sarah and Chris, piled into Jake's beaten-up Ford pickup. The plan was simple. Head out to the old Miller farm, a place that had been abandoned for years, just a few miles outside of town. We wanted to camp there, drink some beers, tell ghost stories, and maybe even sneak a little firelight. Nothing crazy, just the kind of summer adventure we'd laugh about for years. We reached the farm around dusk. The sun was dipping low, casting an orange glow over the tall grass and peeling paint of the farmhouse. The air was warm and thick with the scent of cut hay and wildflowers. The place was quiet. Too quiet, really. No birds chirping, no crickets buzzing. Just this eerie stillness that settled over everything like a warning. We started setting up our tents near the edge of the field, close enough to see the broken-down barn and the twisted remains of an old tractor. The wind was gentle, rustling the tall grass and carrying the faint scent of something burning, though none of us could say where it was coming from. As night fell, we built a small fire and passed around a bottle of cheap whiskey Jake had smuggled from his older brother's stash. The crackling firelight painted our faces in orange and shadow, making everything feel more intimate, more alive. Sarah began telling the story about Old Man Miller, the last owner of the farm. Legend had it he was a cruel man who disappeared one summer night and was never seen again. Some said he'd made a deal with something dark. Others whispered about a terrible accident that left the land cursed. Chris laughed it off, saying those were just old wives' tales designed to scare kids away from the farm. But as he spoke, I noticed the way his eyes darted to the tree line beyond the field, as if expecting something to appear. The night deepened, and the stars spilled across the sky in a brilliant cascade. The fire dwindled, and the temperature dropped just enough to make us pull our jackets tighter around ourselves. We sat in silence for a while, listening to the sounds of the night, or rather, the lack of them. That's when I first noticed the shadow. It was a figure standing just at the edge of the trees, motionless and watching us. At first, I thought it was Jake messing around, trying to freak us out. But when I nudged him and asked, he shook his head, eyes wide. "Did you see that?" I whispered. Jake nodded slowly, squinting into the darkness. "Yeah, but it's probably just some kid or a drunk. This place is a hangout for weirdos," he said, trying to sound casual but failing. Sarah swallowed hard and stared past us. Chris was gripping the edge of his seat, his usual bravado gone. The figure didn't move. It was tall, maybe a man, but I couldn't make out any features. The darkness clung to it like a cloak. Suddenly it vanished. We all blinked, and the space was empty again, save for the swaying branches. We told ourselves it was a trick of the light or our imagination, but none of us felt comfortable anymore. Trying to shake the tension, Jake suggested we call it a night. We climbed into our tents, but sleep didn't come easy. I kept hearing the crackle of dry leaves, faint footsteps, and the whisper of wind that sounded almost like voices. Around 2 a.m., I woke to the sound of someone, or something, moving outside. The tents rustled as if someone was brushing against them. My heart pounded in my chest. I wanted to tell the others, but I was too scared to move. Then a voice. It was soft, barely more than a breath, and it came from the darkness just beyond the fire's glow. "Leave. Now." I froze. The voice was unmistakably real and right there. My skin crawled, every hair on my body standing on end. I fumbled for my phone, but there was no signal. I woke Jake. He was pale but alert. We woke Sarah and Chris quietly. None of us wanted to believe what we'd heard. Then came the footsteps. Slow, deliberate, circling the fire, crunching dry twigs and leaves. The flames flickered violently, casting dancing shadows that seemed to close in on us. The fire sputtered and died. The darkness was absolute. Then the figure stepped into the light. It was old, impossibly thin, with skin stretched tight over bones like parchment. Its eyes were hollow pits, black and unblinking. Its mouth opened, revealing teeth stained and sharp, and it let out a dry, rasping laugh that chilled me to the core. We scrambled into the truck, slamming doors and locking them as the creature advanced. It raised a bony hand and pointed at us, and the air grew cold enough to see our breath. Jake hit the ignition, tires spinning on gravel as we sped away, headlights cutting through the darkness, leaving the cursed farm behind. We never spoke much about that night afterward, but sometimes, when the summer wind rustles the trees just right, I swear I hear that voice, soft and warning. Leave. Now. Story the end. The summer of 1998 was one of those relentless stretches of heat that seemed to stretch forever, with days where the sun baked everything to a dry, shimmering haze, and nights that didn't offer much relief. I was 19, home from my freshman year at a small state university, spending the summer in a quiet town in rural Indiana. The kind of place where everyone knows everyone else, and the biggest events are the annual county fair and a few scattered fireworks on the 4th of July. It was the kind of summer that promised lazy nights, hanging out on front porches with friends, and just enough adventure to keep boredom at bay. But that summer, I learned that sometimes the quietest places hide the darkest things. I was living with my older cousin Jake. He was 24, a mechanic at the local garage, and something of a free spirit with a love for motorcycles and old horror movies. Jake's place was a modest farmhouse on the edge of town, set back from the main road by a half-mile of gravel driveway and surrounded on three sides by thick woods. The house had seen better days, with peeling paint and a porch that creaked like it might collapse any second. But it was home to us that summer. Most nights, after a long day of odd jobs and hanging around town, we'd sit out on the porch with a couple of beers, the hum of cicadas filling the night air. The sky was clear that July, stars blazing like they were trying to burn through the humidity. It was on one of those nights, muggy still, the kind that made you want to crawl under the sheets but instead kept you sweating and restless, that things started to feel off. Jake's best friend, a guy named Tyler, was over that night. Tyler was loud, always joking, but had a serious side when it came to the woods. He grew up hunting and camping nearby and swore that the forest held secrets most folks didn't want to talk about. I didn't believe him much, just the usual ghost stories and local legends. Around 11 p.m., we decided to go for a walk through the woods behind Jake's house. The trail wasn't much, a rough dirt path that disappeared quickly into thick undergrowth, but it was enough for a little night adventure. Tyler insisted we take flashlights, even though the moon was nearly full, casting an eerie silver glow on everything. As we walked deeper into the trees, the temperature seemed to drop. The sounds of the night, the chirping crickets, the rustling leaves, grew quieter until it felt like we were walking through a vacuum. The path twisted and turned, and the trees grew taller and denser, their branches clawing at the sky like skeletal fingers. Tyler led us toward a clearing he called the Hollow. He said it was a spot the old-timers warned kids to stay away from, but none of us really knew why. The air felt heavier as we approached, and I could swear the shadows in the woods seemed darker, almost pooling on the ground. When we reached the clearing, I stopped dead in my tracks. There was a fire pit in the center, old and blackened, with charred logs arranged in a rough circle. Around it were strange symbols scratched into the dirt, circles, lines, shapes I didn't recognize. The air smelled faintly of something burnt and sharp, like sulfur mixed with pine. Tyler knelt down and traced one of the symbols with his finger. "People say some folks use this spot for rituals," he said, voice low. "Back before the town was even here." Jake scoffed. "You've been reading too many stories, man." But I wasn't so sure. The hair on the back of my neck stood up, and I felt an icy chill despite the heat. The woods around us were completely silent now. No animals, no insects, nothing but the sound of our breathing and the crunch of dry leaves beneath our feet. We decided to turn back, but as we did, I thought I saw movement in the trees. A figure, maybe, stepping between the trunks and watching us. I blinked and it was gone. We hurried back down the path, the shadows seeming to twist and close in behind us. When we reached the house, the normal night noises returned, but the feeling of being watched lingered. Over the next few nights, strange things started happening. At first, it was little stuff. Footsteps in the attic when no one was up there, the porch light flickering on and off, the sense that something was lurking just beyond the edge of the yard. One night, I woke to the sound of whispering outside my bedroom window. It was barely audible, like a breath or a sigh carried on the wind. I looked out, but saw nothing. The woods were dark and silent. Jake dismissed it, saying it was probably an animal or the wind. But Tyler was more serious. He said the woods were restless, and whatever was out there was angry we'd disturbed their place. The tension built over the weeks. We stopped going near the hollow, but the feeling of unease spread through the house. Doors would creak open on their own, objects moved from where we left them, and sometimes at night we'd hear distant cries that sounded human but too distorted to be real. One evening, around midnight, Jake and I were sitting on the porch when we heard it, a slow, dragging sound coming from the woods. It was too heavy to be an animal, and too rhythmic to be the wind. We grabbed flashlights and headed toward the edge of the trees. As we stepped into the shadows, the beam of the flashlight caught something that made my blood run cold. There, just beyond the tree line, was a figure. It was tall and thin, draped in rags that hung like wet cloth. Its face was obscured by shadow, but the eyes, two glowing pinpricks of red, locked onto us. We froze. The figure didn't move, just watched, its presence filling the space between the trees like smoke. Jake whispered, "Run." We didn't hesitate. The path back was a blur of branches and undergrowth as we sprinted toward the house. Behind us, the sound of slow footsteps followed, deliberate and unrelenting. We burst onto the porch, slamming the door shut and locking it. For hours we sat there, flashlights and knives in hand, listening to the sounds outside. The dragging footsteps circling, the whispers growing louder, the air thick with something foul. By dawn, the noises faded. Exhausted and shaken, we vowed never to go near those woods again. That summer ended with us moving out of the farmhouse early. Jake found a job in the city, and I went back to school, but the memories stayed. Years later, I learned that the Hollow was the site of an old, forgotten settlement where strange disappearances were rumored, and locals still avoided the woods after dark. Some say what we saw was a spirit bound to that place. Others claim it was something older, something angry. I don't know what it was, but I know that summer night changed me. Sometimes when the heat of summer presses in and the cicadas cry, I remember the eyes glowing in the dark and the feeling of something watching just beyond the trees, and I'm glad I never went back. Story the end. That summer night started like any other in our small Ohio town. The kind of evening where the sun had just dipped behind the horizon, leaving a soft glow on the edges of the clouds, and the heat from the day still clung to everything. I was 19, freshly out of high school, working a part-time job at the local diner, and looking forward to the weekends when the real freedom of summer kicked in. My two best friends, Emily and Jake, and I had been planning a camping trip for weeks. Nothing fancy, just pitching a tent out at Miller's Creek, a spot about 30 minutes out of town where we could swim, drink, and talk late into the night without anyone bothering us. It was a place we'd been going to since we were kids, a patch of woods and water that felt like our secret escape. We piled into Jake's old Chevy around 7 p.m., loaded with backpacks, a cooler full of soda and beers, and enough snacks to last us the night. The drive out was quiet at first, just the radio humming and the summer bugs buzzing outside the windows. As we got farther from the town, the paved roads gave way to dirt, and the trees grew thicker, blocking out the streetlights. When we reached the creek, the air was cooler, damp with the smell of wet earth and leaves. We unloaded our gear and found a clearing near the water's edge where we set up our tent. The sky was a deep navy blue, sprinkled with stars, and a crescent moon hung low, casting just enough light to see by. Emily immediately stripped down her swimsuit and dove into the water, splashing and laughing. Jake and I followed, the cool creek water a sharp contrast to the sticky heat of the day. We swam around, floating on our backs and pointing out constellations until the chill started to set in and we climbed out to dry off. We sat by the fire pit, which Jake had built, the flames flickering and sending shadows dancing across the trees. The night was filled with the sound of crickets and the occasional call of an owl. We passed around beers and swapped stories, silly childhood memories, dreams for the future, the kind of easy talk that made the world seem simple. But as the hours wore on, something shifted. The fire sputtered and dimmed despite Jake's efforts to feed it more wood. The crickets stopped chirping, and the owl's call ceased, replaced by a silence that felt unnatural and thick, like the air itself had stopped moving. Emily shivered, pulling her hoodie tighter around her. "Do you guys hear that?" she whispered. Jake and I strained to listen. At first, nothing. Then, a faint sound, a rhythmic crunching coming from the woods behind us. Slow steps, deliberate, too heavy to be an animal. Probably just a raccoon, Jake said, trying to keep his voice light. But I caught the edge of tension in it. We all looked toward the trees, but the darkness swallowed everything beyond the firelight. The steps grew closer, and with them came a faint rustling of branches. Emily stood up, peering into the shadows. Maybe someone else is out here, she said. Should we call out? Before we could answer, a low, guttural growl echoed from the woods, sending a chill down my spine. Jake grabbed a long stick from the ground, holding it out like a weapon, his eyes scanning the dark. The steps stopped, replaced by an eerie silence. Then, from the right side of the clearing, a figure emerged, tall, hunched, moving awkwardly, almost like it wasn't quite human. The moonlight caught on its face briefly, revealing pale skin stretched tight over sharp cheekbones, eyes glowing faintly red. Emily gasped and stumbled back, knocking over a chair. Jake shouted, "Get back!" But the figure didn't run. Instead, it tilted its head, watching us with those unnatural eyes. I felt frozen, every instinct screaming at me to run, but my body wouldn't move. The figure took a step forward, and I saw its hands, long, claw-like fingers ending in dirty nails. What are you?" I finally managed to whisper. The creature let out a sound that was part growl, part hiss, then lunged toward the fire pit. Jake swung the stick, connecting with a sickening thud, and the thing recoiled, snarling. We scrambled to our feet, grabbing whatever we could find to defend ourselves, sticks, rocks, anything. The fire suddenly roared back to life, as if fed by some unseen force, casting the creature's shadow huge against the trees. It screeched and disappeared into the woods, leaving us panting and wide-eyed. We didn't wait to see if it would come back. We packed up in a frenzy and jumped into Jake's truck, peeling out of the dirt road and back toward town, headlights cutting through the darkness. For weeks after, we avoided Miller's Creek. Every time we drove by, I felt like something was watching us, lurking just beyond the tree line. No one else ever reported anything strange there. But for us, that summer night marked a boundary. A place we'd never return to, haunted not by ghosts, but by something far older, something that didn't belong in our world. Even now, years later, when the summer night grows still and the air thickens with heat and silence, I remember that creature's eyes, glowing red in the dark, and the feeling of being utterly powerless in the face of something so wrong. Story the end. It was the kind of summer night that seems ordinary at first. Warm, still, with the sky thick and sticky after a day of relentless heat. In the small town of Cedar Grove, Ohio, those evenings were common, where families sat on their porches with fans running, crickets chirped steadily, and the occasional distant bark of a dog punctuated the quiet. The streets emptied early, the air held a weight you could feel in your chest, the kind of heavy calm before a storm. That night was the last one I expected to change everything. I was 18, freshly graduated from high school, eager for whatever the summer held. Most of my friends were leaving for college or jobs, but a few of us stayed behind, clinging to the familiar rhythms of small-town life. The four of us, me, my best friend Mark, his younger sister Ellie, and her boyfriend Jason, had planned to meet up at Mark's house, a modest ranch on the edge of town near the old railway line. Mark's family had owned the place for years, and while the town was quiet, the area near the tracks had an odd reputation. It was a stretch of rusted rails that no trains had run on for decades, overgrown with weeds and shadowed by thick trees. Local kids dared each other to walk it at night, whispering stories of strange figures and eerie noises, but no one ever took it seriously. Just a little folklore, harmless nonsense. We decided to start the evening with a bonfire in Mark's backyard. We gathered firewood, set up some lawn chairs, and brought snacks and sodas. Ellie and Jason arrived just before sundown, and the four of us settled around the fire as the sun dipped behind the trees. The air smelled like smoke and pine, and the stars began to prick through the darkening sky. Mark was the jokester, always cracking wise, trying to lighten the mood. I was quieter, more prone to watching and listening. Ellie was lively but nervous. She didn't like the woods much, and Jason, who was a bit older than us, seemed calm and confident, the kind of guy who didn't scare easily. As the fire crackled and the temperature dropped just a little, Mark suggested we take a walk to the old tracks. It was a familiar spot, and the night felt perfect for it. Quiet, with a slight breeze rustling through the leaves. The four of us stood, stretching after sitting for hours, and grabbed flashlights. Ellie hesitated but didn't argue. We left Mark's yard and headed toward the overgrown path leading to the railway line. The streetlights faded behind us, replaced by the glow of our flashlights cutting narrow paths through the dark. The air smelled damp, heavy with earth and decaying leaves. As we entered the woods lining the tracks, the sounds of the town fell away, replaced by the chirping of insects and the occasional hoot of an owl. The trees arched overhead, their branches like skeletal fingers against the night sky. I remember feeling that strange, hollow silence that comes when you're far enough from civilization, where you're isolated, surrounded by shadows that seem to move just beyond the light. The rails appeared ahead, their rusted surface barely visible beneath the moonlight. The tracks stretched straight into the darkness, flanked on either side by tall weeds and tangled underbrush. Mark led the way, his flashlight bobbing as he stepped onto the wooden ties. Ellie and Jason followed close behind, and I stayed at the rear, scanning the woods around us. We joked about the old stories, phantoms that haunted the rails, the ghostly train that never arrived, whispers of kids who disappeared long ago. But as the minutes passed, the humor faded. The night grew heavier. The shadows deepened. It was Jason who first stopped. He held up his hand, signaling us to be quiet. "I hear something," he said softly. We all froze. There was a low humming, faint at first, like a distant tune someone was whistling. It drifted through the trees, an eerie melody that didn't belong. Ellie clutched Mark's arm, her eyes wide. The humming grew louder, vibrating through the air like a pulse. It wasn't a song I recognized. It was hollow and slow, almost hypnotic. We scanned the area with our flashlights, but saw nothing but the empty rails and swaying weeds. Suddenly, the humming stopped. The woods plunged into silence so complete it was suffocating. I swallowed hard and took a step forward, but the beam of my flashlight caught something that made me freeze. There, just beyond the edge of the trees, was a figure. Tall, motionless, dressed in what looked like tattered clothes, its face hidden in shadow. It didn't move, but the way it stood made my skin crawl, like it was watching us. Ellie gasped and tried to step back, but her foot caught on a root, and she stumbled, falling against the gravel. Jason rushed to help her, but the figure didn't flinch. Mark whispered my name, his voice shaky. "What is that?" Before I could answer, the figure turned its head, slowly, unnaturally, toward us. There was no face, just a dark void where eyes should have been, a blackness that swallowed the faint moonlight. I felt a cold numbness spread through my body, like a freeze creeping from my chest outward. The humming started again, low, insistent. "Come closer," a voice whispered. It was hollow, distant, but unmistakable. We all took a step back, but the figure seemed to grow larger, looming closer in the shadows. Jason grabbed Ellie's hand, pulling her toward the woods. "Run." We bolted. Branches scraped against our faces and arms as we stumbled through the underbrush, heartbeats pounding in our ears. I tripped over a root, fell hard, and felt a sharp sting on my knee. The voice called after us, fading as we ran, "Come closer." We didn't stop until we burst back into Mark's yard, gasping for breath, the safety of the porch lights washing over us like a shield. Ellie was crying. Jason, pale but steady. Mark's hands shook as he locked the door behind us. For the rest of the night, we sat inside, the windows shut tight, lights blazing. None of us could sleep. The next day, we tried to explain it away. Our minds playing tricks, the figure a trick of shadows, the voice the wind. But when Mark went back to the tracks in the afternoon to check, he found deep footprints in the soft dirt, huge, too big for any person our size. No one ever went near those tracks again. Every summer night after, I would feel the weight of that dark presence, hear the faint humming carried on the wind, and remember the faceless figure waiting in the shadows. It wasn't just a story, it was real. Story the end. The summer air was thick with humidity, the kind that makes the night feel alive but sluggish, like a slow-moving river you're caught in. It was the kind of evening that drapes over a small Midwestern town in July, where the cicada's relentless chorus pulses through the trees and the scent of fresh-cut grass mingles with the faint, sweet smell of honeysuckle hanging from fences. I was 19, home for the summer between college semesters, and restless in that way only summer nights can make you too hot to sleep, but too tired to do much besides wander. That particular night, I'd been at my friend Caleb's house, down by the edge of town, just past the little park where kids used to play when we were younger. Caleb and I were sitting on his porch steps, drinking cheap beer and talking about nothing in particular, the kind of aimless conversation that stretches out into hours when you have nowhere to be. The streetlights cast a dull orange glow that barely touched the dense shadows where the trees stood guard like silent sentinels. Beyond those trees was the forest, the kind you don't wander into after dark, especially when you're alone. At some point, Caleb's dog, a scrappy mutt named Gus, started barking low and hard toward the edge of the woods. It was the kind of bark that makes your skin crawl, a warning. Caleb swore it was probably just a raccoon or some deer, but the feeling in my gut was different. Something wasn't right. We stood up, trying to peer into the shadows, but the trees looked empty. Still, the hair on my arms was prickling. "I don't like this," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. Caleb laughed, though it didn't quite reach his eyes. "It's just the woods, man. Don't let your imagination get the better of you." We decided to walk back toward my place, which wasn't far, but as we started down the cracked sidewalk, the night seemed to close in around us. The usual sounds of the neighborhood, distant laughter, the hum of passing cars, were muted, replaced by a thick silence punctuated only by Gus's uneasy growling. Halfway there, Caleb stopped and looked behind us. "You hear that?" I strained my ears and then caught it, a faint sound, almost like someone humming. But it wasn't music, not really, more like a slow, repetitive chant, barely audible over the night sounds. "Probably just kids messing around," Caleb said, but his tone was uncertain. We kept moving, faster now, but the humming seemed to follow, drifting closer through the trees. It wasn't a tune I recognized, old, weird, and haunting. Suddenly, Gus bolted toward the woods, barking fiercely. Caleb and I yelled for him to stop, but he vanished into the shadows. For a moment, the chanting stopped. Then, from deep within the trees, a chilling voice called out, soft, cold, and filled with a hunger that made my blood run cold. We didn't wait to find out what it was. We ran. The next day, Gus came home, panting and trembling, his fur matted with mud. He had scratches all over his body, but otherwise seemed unharmed. We never found out what chased him into those woods, but after that night, the chanting never returned. Still, sometimes late at night, I swear I can hear it faintly on the wind. The same slow, eerie hum that no one else ever seems to notice. That summer, I learned that some nights are better left undisturbed, and some places hold secrets that don't want to be found. Story the end. The summer of '98 was one I'll never forget. It was a blistering, suffocating heat that made the days feel like they stretched on forever, and the nights offered little relief. I was 18, about to start my senior year of high school in a small town in Ohio, a place where everyone knew everyone else, and the only real excitement came from the occasional county fair or fireworks show. But that summer night, something happened that shattered the quiet, safe bubble of my hometown, something that still gives me chills when I think back on it. I was hanging out with my two best friends, Ryan and Lisa. We had grown up together, practically inseparable since middle school, and every summer night was spent riding bikes, sitting on porches, or wandering around town. That night, it was hot enough to sweat just sitting still, and the sky was a deep purple as the sun sank behind the trees. We decided to bike out to the old quarry on the edge of town, an abandoned gravel pit that kids often snuck into, mostly to swim or hang out away from prying eyes. The quarry was maybe 2 miles from town, down a narrow road lined with thick woods on both sides. The ride was slow because the asphalt was cracked and the weeds were starting to take over. When we got there, the place was eerily quiet except for the faint splash of water from the far side where the quarry pool was. We parked our bikes and walked down to the water's edge, the air thick with humidity and the scent of damp earth. The pool was deep and still, surrounded by jagged rocks and overgrown with wildflowers and tall grass. We didn't have permission to be there, but the thrill of being somewhere forbidden was part of the draw. Ryan dared Lisa to jump in first, and she laughed, stripped down to her shorts and tank top, and dove into the water. Ryan and I followed after, the cold water shocking against our sun-baked skin. We swam and laughed, splashing around under the stars. After a while, we climbed out, sitting on the rocky edge, drying off and talking about school, summer jobs, and everything we thought mattered then. The moon was rising, a thin crescent hanging low over the trees. As we sat there, I noticed something odd. From the tree line, a faint light flickered, like a flashlight bobbing through the woods. "Did you see that?" I asked, squinting toward the trees. Ryan shrugged. "Probably some other kids messing around." Lisa looked nervous. "Maybe we should pack up. It's getting late." But none of us moved right away. The light grew closer, weaving through the trees, slow and steady. Then we heard something else, the sound of footsteps crunching on the dry leaves behind us. "Did you hear that?" Lisa whispered, pulling her knees to her chest. Ryan nodded, standing up and scanning the tree line. "It's probably someone hiking or a hunter. We're out of season, though." The footsteps were getting louder, and the beam of light was shining directly toward us now. It was bright and steady, the kind of light a heavy-duty flashlight gives off. "Hey!" Ryan called out. "Who's there?" No answer, just the flashlight moving closer. Lisa grabbed my arm, trembling. "I don't like this." I wanted to tell her we were safe, that whoever it was would just move on. But something about the way the light flicked across the trees, the slow, deliberate steps, it didn't feel right. Suddenly, a voice broke the night, low, rough, and unmistakably angry. "This is private property. Get out." Ryan frowned. "We're just here to swim. We'll leave." The voice didn't respond. Instead, the flashlight beam landed on a figure stepping out of the trees, a tall man wearing a dark hat and a flannel shirt, his face partly obscured by shadows. He had eyes that seemed too dark, too sharp, and a mouth set in a thin, unforgiving line. "Leave now," he repeated, his voice harder. We packed up quickly, but as we turned to leave, I caught a glimpse of something strange, a second figure lurking deeper in the woods, just beyond the flashlight's reach. I pointed, but Ryan and Lisa didn't see it. We rode back toward town, the gravel crunching beneath our tires. Behind us, in the distance, I thought I heard the faint sound of footsteps, but when I glanced back, there was nothing. The next day, rumors started. Some people said the old quarry was owned by a man who didn't like trespassers. Others whispered about disappearances and strange noises at night. I never went back after that summer night, and sometimes when I'm alone in the dark, I swear I can still hear footsteps behind me. Story the end. That summer was supposed to be different for me. I just finished my junior year in high school, and the town where I grew up, small, sleepy, somewhere in western Pennsylvania, felt like it was drowning in the heat and the hum of cicadas. Everyone said summer nights there were supposed to be easy, bonfires, late night swimming, hanging out with friends until the stars disappeared. But that night, in July of 2013, everything changed. It started earlier in the evening. My friend Tom had invited me and a few others to his family's property on the outskirts of town. Tom's family owned a big chunk of land, acres of forest, a creek, and an old barn that hadn't been used in years. It was the kind of place where you could escape the noise and the smallness of the town, but it was also the kind of place where stories about things that go bump in the night thrived. Everyone in our group knew them, but no one talked about them seriously. Just ghost stories, or so we thought. We all met up around 9 p.m., just as the sun was setting. Tom had planned a bonfire in the clearing near the creek. The five of us, Tom, me, Sarah, Jake, and Liz, loaded up a couple of coolers and headed out in his truck. The drive was short, winding through old back roads flanked by towering oaks and maples, their leaves whispering in the light breeze. The sky was that perfect summer blue to orange gradient, promising a warm night. When we arrived, the clearing was already perfect. Dry grass, scattered logs around the fire pit, and the creek just a few yards away, its gentle rush a soothing backdrop. We set to work, gathering wood, building the fire, and soon we were sitting around it, the flames flickering and casting long shadows. Sarah and Liz passed around marshmallows and told silly stories, while Tom and Jake talked about plans for the summer. Everything felt normal, comfortable even. But around 11 p.m., the wind shifted and the sounds of the forest changed. The usual chorus of frogs and insects dimmed. The air grew thick with a heavy silence that seemed to press down on us. Jake was the first to notice. "Hey, do you guys hear that?" We all stopped talking and listened. There was a faint sound, soft footsteps, crunching leaves, but nothing visible beyond the firelight. The woods around us looked still, but the feeling was undeniable. Something was out there, just beyond the circle of firelight. Probably just an animal, Tom said, though even his voice lacked confidence. I tried to shrug it off, but my heart was already starting to race. Then Sarah pointed toward the tree line on the far side of the creek. "Did you see that?" At first, I thought she was joking, but her eyes were wide with fear. There, barely visible among the trees, was a figure. It was tall, thin, and oddly still. Not moving like a person at all. We all squinted, trying to make sense of it. The firelight didn't reach that far, and the moon was still rising. The figure was almost a silhouette, but the shape was wrong, too angular, limbs elongated. Jake got up, grabbing his flashlight. "I'm going to check it out." "No," Sarah said sharply. "Don't." But Jake was already stepping away from the group, heading toward the creek. "Wait," I called, standing up quickly. "It's not safe. Let me come with you." The rest of the group stayed back by the fire, voices hushed, watching us. Tom handed me another flashlight, and together we walked toward the figure. The creek was cold and clear as we crossed it, stones slick under our feet. The night was eerily silent now. No crickets, no frogs, just our footsteps and the rush of water. As we neared the edge of the trees, I felt the temperature drop sharply. My breath came out in frosty puffs, though the night was still warm. The flashlight beams danced nervously across the underbrush. Then we saw it again. The figure was standing just inside the woods, staring at us with eyes that gleamed unnaturally in the dark. I couldn't make out a face, just two glowing orbs that pierced the night. Jake swallowed hard. Then the figure moved too fast, like a blur. It darted behind a tree and vanished. "Did you see that?" Jake whispered. I nodded, feeling my skin crawl. We backed away slowly, trying to keep calm, but my hands were shaking. When we got back to the fire, the others looked terrified. "Tell us what you saw," Tom said. We told them everything, the figure, the glowing eyes, the way it moved. Suddenly, Liz pointed behind us and my blood ran cold. There, at the edge of the clearing, stood another figure, closer this time. Its shape more defined, like a person, but wrong. The skin was grayish, almost translucent, and its mouth was wide open in a silent scream. No eyes, only hollow black sockets. We all froze. The fire sputtered as the wind picked up. "Run," I said, and we all bolted toward Tom's truck. Branches slapped our faces, roots caught our feet, but nothing slowed us. When we reached the truck, Tom fumbled with the keys, hands shaking. The engine roared to life, and we sped away down the dirt road, headlights cutting through the trees. None of us spoke the whole ride back. The rest of the summer passed in a blur, but none of us went back to the farm. Sometimes I still hear footsteps outside my window, or catch a glimpse of something watching me from the edge of the woods. That summer night changed everything. And I still don't know what was out there. Story the end. The heat that summer night was the kind that pressed down on your skin and left it clammy with sweat no matter how much you tried to avoid it. It was the kind of evening where even the cicadas seemed to drone a little slower, as if the world was just too exhausted to keep up their usual summer chorus. I was 22, home from college for the summer, and for the first time in months, I felt a restless itch to get out and do something. Anything. Different. I was with two friends from high school, Jamie and Alex. Jamie was the kind of guy who could make a joke out of any situation, no matter how serious. Alex was quieter, the thoughtful one, always watching and listening. We'd driven around aimlessly for a couple of hours, windows down, music low, just soaking up the stifling night air. The town was small, the streets mostly empty. We were searching for something, though none of us could say what. Jamie finally suggested we head out to the old quarry. It was about 10 miles from town, down a winding back road lined with thick trees that had grown taller than any of us remembered. The quarry had been closed for decades, a forgotten scar in the earth, overgrown and mostly ignored. We'd all been there as teenagers, sneaking off for midnight swims or dares, but something about it had changed since then. We piled into Jamie's truck and made our way down the gravel road, headlights piercing the darkness ahead, the radio crackling with static between songs. As we neared the quarry entrance, the trees seemed to close in tighter, and the air smelled damp and earthy, almost like rain was coming, though the sky was clear. Jamie pulled the truck off the road into a small clearing, and we climbed out, the gravel crunching under our shoes. The moon was low, casting a silvery light over the dark water that filled the quarry pit. The surface was still and black, reflecting the stars like a broken mirror. We stood at the edge, the cold night pressing in around us, the silence heavy except for the distant hum of cicadas. Jamie skipped a rock, watching it bounce twice, then sink. Alex broke the silence. You ever get the feeling that something's watching you out here? I laughed nervously. It's just the woods, man. Trees don't watch. But even as I said it, I felt it too. Something just beyond the reach of the moonlight, hiding in the shadows at the tree line. A flicker of movement, too slow and subtle to be a person, but too deliberate to be a deer or raccoon. Jamie shrugged and said, "Probably just your imagination." We settled down on some fallen logs near the water, passing around a bottle of cheap whiskey Jamie had brought. The night stretched on, and the stories came out, local legends about the quarry, disappearances, things seen but never explained. That's when I first heard it, a splash from the far side of the water. Not a single splash, but several, like something large moving just under the surface. We all froze, eyes darting toward the noise. Jamie shined his flashlight across the water, the beam trembling slightly in his hand. Nothing. Then a chill ran down my spine as I noticed the temperature drop. It wasn't just a trick of the wind. The air itself felt colder, heavier. The hum of cicadas fell silent. A low, wet, gurgling sound rose from the depths of the quarry like someone or something was trying to break the surface. Alex stood up, voice tight. We should go. Before any of us could move, the water exploded. A figure burst out with a wet, splashing crash, thrashing toward the shore. It was pale, gaunt, and soaked, eyes wide with a feral intensity. We scrambled back, tripping over roots and rocks as it lunged at us, limbs flailing. Jamie grabbed a broken branch and swung it, catching the figure's shoulder. It howled, a terrible, gurgling sound that echoed across the quarry, and retreated back into the water, disappearing beneath the surface with ripples that never quite stopped. We didn't stop running until we were back in Jamie's truck, doors locked, engine roaring. I looked back once as we sped down the road, catching a glimpse of that pale face watching us from the tree line. No one spoke for the rest of the drive, the kind of silence that wraps around you and won't let go. In the weeks that followed, strange things happened. Shadows moved just beyond sight, whispers floated through the night air, and sometimes when I was alone in my room, I heard the faint sound of splashing water beneath my window. I don't know what we saw that night. Some twisted creature risen from the depths? A person lost too long in the darkness? I can't say. But I do know this. Some places are meant to be left alone, and some summer nights carry secrets better left undiscovered. Story the end. That night in the summer of 2007 started out like any other warm, sticky evening in rural Missouri. The kind of night where the heat clings to your skin and the sky is thick with the buzzing chorus of cicadas. I was 19, home for the summer break from college, and hanging out with my close friends, Matt, Sarah, and Jake. We had been looking forward to this night for weeks because Matt's family owned a cabin out near the edge of the Mark Twain National Forest, a place we'd all been to before, but never at night. We decided to drive out late, around 10 p.m., loaded with snacks, beers, and a couple of flashlights, just wanting to sit by the campfire and maybe tell some ghost stories. The ride was calm, windows down, the air humid but bearable with the night breeze rushing through the truck. The road to the cabin was nothing but a narrow dirt trail, lined thick with trees and brush, and by the time we got there, the sky was a deep navy, sprinkled with stars. The cabin itself was old, rustic, a wooden structure built maybe 50 years ago, simple but sturdy. There was a porch with a couple of rocking chairs, a fire pit close by, and behind it, the thick forest that stretched for miles. We set up the fire, and as the flames grew, the four of us settled around it. The smell of smoke mixed with pine and damp earth. We cracked open beers, the quiet hum of the forest settling in around us. For a while it was easy. Laughing, telling stories, the usual teenage bravado in the dark. At some point, Matt mentioned he'd heard about an old trail nearby, one that nobody used anymore because it was rumored to be cursed. He laughed it off, but there was a glint in his eyes that told me he was half serious. Jake, always the daring one, suggested we check it out. Sarah looked uneasy, but none of us wanted to be the first to say no. We grabbed our flashlights and started down the path. The trees closed in tight, branches scraping against our clothes. The beam from our flashlights was thin and shaky, flickering as we moved deeper into the woods. The air seemed to grow colder, heavier. It wasn't long before the laughter faded. The night sounds, the frogs, the crickets, the rustling leaves, fell silent as if the forest itself was holding its breath. I felt it immediately, that prickling sensation on the back of my neck. Up ahead, Matt stopped suddenly, pointing his flashlight toward a clearing. There, standing motionless, was a figure. Tall and thin, its shape indistinct in the shadows, but unmistakably human, except for the way it stood, too rigid like a statue. We called out, voices shaking. The figure didn't move. Then, without warning, it turned sharply and disappeared into the trees. We followed, adrenaline surging, but when we reached the spot, there was nothing, just the rustling leaves and the empty forest. That's when the footsteps began, not ours, but heavy, slow, and deliberate, coming from all directions. We ran, branches whipping our faces, the sounds chasing us all the way back to the cabin. When we reached the porch, the door slammed shut behind us, as if by a gust of wind. We locked it and huddled inside, breathless and wide-eyed. The rest of the night was a blur of shadows and whispers that seemed to seep through the walls. By morning, we were ready to leave, shaken but safe. To this day, I don't know what we saw or heard out there that summer night, but some nights when the wind shifts just right, I swear I hear those footsteps again, slow and heavy, just beyond the edge of the trees. Story the end. That summer night was one of those that started out like any other. Warm, sticky air hanging thick over the small Ohio town where I grew up. The kind of night where you feel like the whole world has slowed down, wrapped in a heavy blanket of humidity and buzzing cicadas. I was 19, freshly out of community college for the summer, working a boring job at the local gas station. My friends and I had been planning to get out of town for a bit, escape the suffocating smallness of our lives for a night. We'd heard about this stretch of woods a few miles out of town where no one went after dark, the kind of place where people said strange things happened. We thought it was the perfect spot for a little adventure. There were 5 of us that night. Me, my best friend Tommy, Sarah, Mike, and Jenny. We piled into Mike's old beat-up Jeep just after sunset, the sky still painted with streaks of orange and purple, as we took the back roads that led out past the old quarry, past the crumbling barns and fields that stretched farther than you could see. The Jeep's headlights cut through the twilight, and the windows were down, letting in the late summer breeze that smelled like earth and wildflowers. We joked and laughed as we drove, teasing each other, tossing around stories about haunted houses and local legends. Sarah told us about the Lady in White, a ghost said to wander the nearby riverbanks, mourning her lost child. Mike mocked her story, while Tommy and I exchanged knowing glances. We'd heard these stories before, but they always sounded more convincing when told under the deepening shadows of dusk. When we reached the edge of the woods, the Jeep slowed and then stopped. We climbed out, stretching stiff limbs and pulling on hoodies as the temperature dropped just enough to make the night feel sharp. The forest loomed ahead, dark and thick with ancient oaks and whispering pines, their branches clawing at the sky. We set off down a narrow trail that twisted between trees and over roots, the ground soft with fallen leaves and pine needles. The only sounds were the crunch of our boots and the occasional snap of a twig beneath foot. The deeper we went, the quieter it became. The usual chorus of crickets and frogs had stopped, as if the woods themselves were holding their breath. We reached a small clearing, lit by the pale silver light of the moon filtering through the canopy. The clearing was surrounded by dense thickets and towering trees, their shadows stretching out like fingers trying to grasp us. In the center was a circle of stones, worn smooth and arranged in a rough ring. Someone had built a fire pit there long ago, but it was cold now, just ashes and charred wood. We decided to rest there for a while, pulling out snacks and a couple of beers Mike had brought along. We sat in a loose circle, letting the silence stretch between us, broken only by nervous laughter and half-hearted jokes. Tommy pulled out a flashlight and flicked it on, its beam piercing the darkness beyond the clearing. Sarah shivered. "I don't like this place," she said quietly. "It feels wrong." Mike rolled his eyes. "It's just a bunch of trees. There's nothing here but bugs and dirt." But even he sounded uncertain. After a few minutes, we heard it, a soft rustling from the edge of the clearing, like something moving just beyond the trees. We froze, straining to see through the shadows. The flashlight beam swung slowly, illuminating twisted branches and thick underbrush. Nothing moved. Then a faint sound, a whisper, barely audible, like someone breathing on the wind. It didn't come from any one direction, but it seemed to surround us. I felt a chill crawl up my spine. Jenny whispered, "Did you hear that?" "Probably just the wind," Tommy said, though his voice lacked conviction. We sat in silence, eyes darting toward the darkness. The whispering grew louder, coalescing into words I couldn't quite understand. Soft, broken syllables that seemed to curl around us like smoke. Suddenly, the flashlight flickered and went out. Darkness swallowed us whole. Panic surged through me as I fumbled for my own phone, but the screen wouldn't light up. No signal. No power. The others scrambled too, but nothing worked. The forest seemed to press in on us, an invisible weight tightening around our chests. Then something moved just beyond the clearing's edge. A figure stepped into the faint moonlight, tall and thin, like draped in ragged clothes that fluttered in the night breeze. Its face was obscured by shadows, but I could see glinting eyes reflecting the pale light. A low moan drifted from its throat, echoing in the stillness. Sarah gasped and scrambled back, tripping over a root. Mike shouted and stood, brandishing a broken branch like a weapon. The figure didn't advance, but remained just out of reach, swaying gently as if caught in a trance. The whispering intensified. Now a chorus of voices swirling around us, indistinct but urgent. The air turned ice cold, and my breath came out in frosty puffs. "Run," Tommy said, grabbing my arm. We bolted from the clearing, crashing through underbrush and stumbling over roots, the voices chasing us, echoing in the darkness. Branches whipped against our faces, and the ground disappeared beneath our feet as we tore blindly through the woods. I didn't look back until we burst out onto the gravel road, hearts pounding and lungs burning. The Jeep's headlights were a distant glow, and we ran toward it like it was the only thing keeping us tethered to reality. We piled in, slamming doors and locking them as Mike fumbled with the ignition. The engine roared to life, and we sped away, leaving the forest and its whispers behind. For days afterward, none of us spoke much about what happened, but sometimes, late at night, I'd hear that whispering in my mind, soft and insistent, like a secret, trying to break free. And I'd wonder, what was that thing in the woods? And what would have happened if we hadn't run? Story the end. That summer night began just like any other in our small town nestled in the outskirts of Pennsylvania. The kind of night where the air is thick with humidity, the cicadas hum their relentless song, and the stars hang heavy in the sky, barely visible behind a haze of moisture. I was 21 at the time, freshly out of my second year of college, and home for the summer. My two closest friends, Matt and Sarah, had been back for a few weeks as well, and we were itching to reclaim the small freedoms of our youth before fall swept us away again. We'd planned for weeks to head out to a place called Red Maple Woods, a sprawling patch of forest a little over an hour away. It wasn't exactly popular, mostly locals who knew the place went there, but it had a reputation for being untouched, wild, and quiet. We were drawn to it because it offered a break from the endless buzz of town and the monotony of our everyday lives. We left around 8 p.m., just as the last blush of sunlight disappeared behind the horizon. The drive was easy, with windows down to let in the warm night air mixed with the scent of pine and earth. Matt was driving his dad's old pickup truck, rattling and groaning as it struggled to make it through the gravel roads leading deeper into the woods. Sarah sat beside me in the back seat, scrolling through her phone but clearly distracted, stealing glances out the window at the shadows growing longer and more tangled with every mile. By the time we arrived, the sky was a deep indigo, and the moon was just beginning to peek out from behind thin clouds. We parked near the edge of a small clearing, the truck crunching over the leaf-strewn dirt, and unloaded our backpacks, flashlights, and a cooler filled with soda and a few beers. Our plan was simple: hike a little, find a good spot to camp for the night, maybe build a small fire if we could find enough dry wood, and just be out there, away from everything. The forest was dense, but the air smelled fresh, cool, and alive. We had walked maybe half a mile into the trees when Sarah suddenly stopped and pointed ahead. "Look," she whispered, At the edge of a small clearing ahead of us was a cabin, old and weathered. It was something I had never seen on any map or mentioned by anyone else, which was strange. The cabin looked like it had been abandoned for decades. Wooden boards warped and splintered, windows shattered or covered with thick grime, and the roof sagging under years of neglect. Matt raised an eyebrow. Didn't expect to find a cabin out here. Maybe someone's still living there, Sarah said, eyes wide. We debated whether to explore or keep moving, but curiosity got the best of us. Quietly, we approached the cabin, the crunch of leaves underfoot, the only sound in the heavy stillness. I felt a shiver, though it wasn't from the cool night air. It was something else, something deeper, a silent warning buried in the shadows. The front door hung loosely on its hinges, creaking softly as it swayed in the gentle breeze. We stepped inside, flashlights piercing the gloom. Dust floated in the air, and the faint smell of decay was thick, clinging to the old wood and peeling wallpaper. Furniture lay in ruins, an overturned chair, a collapsed table, and remnants of what must have been a bed frame in the corner. Sarah shivered again and said, "Let's not stay too long." But Matt was already moving deeper inside, shining his light across the floor. That's when he found it, a small journal wedged beneath the remains of a broken floorboard. He picked it up carefully, flipping through pages brittle with age. The writing was cramped and messy, penned by someone in a hurry or under distress. The entries were dated back to the 1960s, and the words told a story of isolation, fear, and something creeping closer from the woods. The writer spoke of hearing strange noises at night, footsteps circling the cabin, shadows that moved of their own accord. The last entry was hastily scrawled, "They're here. I can hear them outside. I don't know how much longer I can hold out." A cold wave swept over me. We exchanged uneasy glances. "We should go," I said firmly. Back outside, the forest seemed to have changed. The comforting sounds of crickets and frogs were gone, replaced by an oppressive silence that stretched in every direction. The shadows between the trees looked darker, deeper, as if they were waiting. Matt laughed nervously and said, "It's just the woods playing tricks." But Sarah and I weren't so sure. We tried to shake off the feeling as we set up our tent a little further from the cabin, close enough to see its outline but far enough to feel safe. The night grew colder and the air hung thick and unmoving. As we sat around a small fire, roasting marshmallows and joking to break the tension, a sudden noise snapped us all to attention. It started as a soft thudding, like footsteps, but steady and slow, coming from just beyond the tree line. Matt grabbed a flashlight, sweeping it in the direction of the sound. Probably an animal. But as the light moved, we caught a glimpse of something. No, someone, standing just at the edge of the woods. A figure, tall and still, watching us. I swallowed hard. The shape had no clear features in the dark, but something about the way it stood, unnervingly still, didn't feel right. Sarah's voice trembled as she whispered, "Do you see that?" Matt shone the flashlight directly at the figure. The light caught its face for a brief second. Pale, gaunt, eyes that seemed too wide and dark, reflecting the beam unnaturally. Then the figure vanished into the night like a shadow melting away. The silence returned, thicker than before. We didn't speak. Instead, we packed up hurriedly, the unease settling in our bones. As we hurried back to the truck, the feeling of being watched never left us. Every crack of a twig, every rustle of leaves set our hearts pounding. When we reached the truck and slammed the doors shut, Matt started the engine, and we sped away, headlights cutting through the darkness as we left the woods behind. But even now, years later, when summer nights stretch long and heavy, I can't forget the way those eyes looked. Empty, endless, and waiting. Story, the end. The summer of 1998 was supposed to be the best summer of my life. I was 19, freshly out of high school, and hanging out with a tight group of friends in our small hometown of Marion, Ohio. It was one of those typical American towns, quiet during the day and even quieter at night, where everyone knew everyone, and most summers were spent just riding bikes, swimming in the local quarry, or hanging out by the river. That particular summer was hotter than usual. The air was thick and heavy, and nights were sticky, almost suffocating. But the heat didn't stop us. We loved the summer nights, the way the sky stretched out above us, speckled with stars, the way the cicadas droned endlessly, and the kind of restless energy that makes you think anything could happen. My group consisted of me, my best friend Chris, his girlfriend Emily, and my cousin Jake. We were inseparable, always up for some adventure or mischief. One Saturday night in late July, we decided to do something different, something a bit daring. We'd heard stories about the old abandoned farmhouse just outside of town. Nobody lived there anymore, not for decades, but rumors swirled about strange noises and lights. Kids at school talked about it being haunted, but no one had ever really gone there at night. The house sat on the edge of a sprawling field about a mile from the town's last streetlight. A narrow dirt road led up to it, flanked by tall cornfields that rustled and whispered when the wind picked up. The kind of place that, if you were alone, would make your skin crawl. We planned to meet at Chris's house around 9 p.m. I rode my bike there, the summer night cool against my sweat, and when I arrived, Emily and Jake were already waiting. Chris was pacing nervously in the driveway. He wasn't usually the anxious type, but tonight there was a tightness in his jaw. "Are you sure about this?" Emily asked, glancing down the dirt road toward the dark silhouette of the farmhouse. Chris shrugged. "It's just an old house. Besides, we're together. What could happen?" Jake smirked. Famous last words. We packed some flashlights, a couple of sodas, and a few beers Chris had smuggled out of his older brother's stash. We planned to explore the farmhouse, maybe take some photos and laughs, and then head back before midnight. The walk to the farmhouse took us about 20 minutes. The air was thick, humid, with the occasional chirp of crickets. The cornfields on either side towered over us, shadows stretching out like giant hands trying to grab us. I remember the way the path seemed narrower the farther we walked, the trees leaning in close, their branches whispering secrets to the night. As we approached the farmhouse, the moon was high, casting a silvery light that made the peeling white paint look almost ghostly. The windows were boarded up, some planks broken or hanging loose. The front door was cracked open, creaking softly with every breeze. Chris shone his flashlight inside the doorway. Dust motes floated in the beam, dancing in the stale air. The wooden floor looked rotten and the air smelled musty, mixed with something faintly metallic. "Here goes nothing," Chris said, stepping inside. We followed him into the house, the floorboards groaning under our weight. The inside was dark, the air cold despite the summer heat outside. We saw old furniture draped in dusty sheets, cobwebs hanging like curtains, and peeling wallpaper revealing faded floral patterns. Emily shivered. "I don't like this. Maybe we should just take some pictures and go." But Jake was already exploring further in, flashlight bobbing as he moved down a narrow hallway. Suddenly, he stopped. "Guys, come see this." We all crowded around as Jake pointed his flashlight at the wall. There, etched into the peeling paint, were strange symbols, circles with lines and dots, almost like some kind of primitive script. "What the hell?" I muttered. Chris ran his hand over the marks. "Looks old. Maybe the original owners did this, or someone else." Emily looked uneasy. Maybe we shouldn't mess with whatever this is. But curiosity won out, as it always does. We continued exploring the house, poking through rooms filled with broken glass and rusted tools. In the kitchen, the sink was clogged and the wallpaper was stained with dark patches. The only sound was our breathing and the occasional creak of the old house settling. Suddenly, I heard a noise behind us, a faint thud, like something heavy falling in the back of the house. I spun around, a flashlight sweeping the shadows, but saw nothing. "Probably just a raccoon," Jake said, though his voice lacked confidence. We moved toward the back door, which led out to a small, overgrown garden. The night air outside was thick with the smell of earth and decay. Fireflies flickered in the tall grass. "Let's take some pictures here," Chris suggested, pulling out his camera. We lined up near a crumbling stone wall, the flash illuminating our faces briefly against the dark. Then, as we prepared to leave, Emily suddenly froze. "Did you hear that?" she whispered. We listened. At first, nothing but the distant sound of insects. Then, a soft whisper, barely audible, like the wind carrying a voice. "Help me." The words were so faint I thought I imagined them. "Come on," Jake said, eager to leave. "This place is creeping me out." We hurried back inside, but the door slammed shut behind us with a force that made us jump. The air inside felt charged, like static before a storm. Chris tried the door, but it wouldn't budge. "Great," he muttered. "We're locked in." Panic crept in. Emily started shaking. "Let me try," I said, pressing my shoulder against the door. It held firm. Then the whispers started again, louder this time. Help me, please. Our flashlights flickered. The temperature dropped, our breath becoming visible in the cold air. Suddenly the lights went out entirely, plunging us into pitch black. I felt a presence nearby, something watching, something waiting. Who's there? Chris shouted. No answer. Then, footsteps, slow, deliberate, circling us. The smell of something rotten filled the air. Emily screamed. I fumbled for my phone to use as a flashlight, but it slipped from my sweaty hands and clattered to the floor. The footsteps stopped. A low growl rumbled in the dark. Suddenly, the front door creaked open. We didn't hesitate. We bolted outside, sprinting across the overgrown yard and back down the dirt road toward town, hearts pounding, lungs burning. When we reached Chris's house, we locked the doors behind us and sat trembling in silence. None of us spoke about what happened inside the farmhouse again. The next morning, news came that a man had been found dead in the cornfields near the abandoned house. No identification, no known relatives, no clues. And late that night, weeks after, I sometimes hear a faint whisper carried on the summer breeze, calling for help, a voice from the darkness that I will never forget. Story the end. That summer night started like any other in my hometown. Slow, sticky, and thick with the sounds of cicadas droning in the dense air. It was the kind of heat that clings to your skin and won't let go, making you sweat through your clothes no matter how still you sit. I was 17, home from school for the break, and looking forward to a night out with my friends. We were kids who hadn't figured out much yet, but we knew the streets and the woods around our small Ohio town like the backs of our hands. We'd decided to hang out by the old quarry just outside of town. The place had been abandoned for years, a jagged pit filled with murky water and steep rock faces. Locals told stories about it, the kind every small town has about a creepy spot no one dares go near once the sun sets. We didn't believe the rumors, of course. We were kids looking for adventure, and the quarry was the perfect place for it. The sun had just dipped below the horizon when we arrived, the sky fading into a bruised purple with the first stars blinking on. The air was heavy, but still enough that the rustle of leaves was sharp in the silence. We were 5 of us, me, Josh, Tina, Mark, and Becky, laughing and joking as we climbed down the trail toward the water's edge. Josh was the first to jump in, wading into the water with a careless grin. The rest of us followed, slipping into the cool depths. The water was shockingly cold, a relief against the summer heat. We swam and splashed, the kind of wild freedom that comes only from being young and unafraid. After a while, we sat on the rocky shore, towels wrapped around us, the water dripping from our skin. That's when we started to hear it. A faint sound, barely audible at first, like the low hum of a voice carried on the wind. It was rhythmic and strange, almost like singing, but not any song we recognized. Tina was the first to notice it. She stopped mid-sentence, her eyes narrowing. "Do you guys hear that?" We all fell quiet, listening. The humming grew louder, but it wasn't coming from any direction we could pinpoint. It seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere all at once. "Probably just the wind," Mark said, but his voice was uneasy. The humming grew into a soft chant, slow and deliberate. The words were indecipherable, but the tone was haunting, calm, almost hypnotic, but with an undercurrent of menace. Becky stood up abruptly, brushing water from her hair. "I'm going to check it out," she said, her voice shaking. "No, wait," I started, but she was already moving toward the thick woods that bordered the quarry. We called after her, but she disappeared into the trees, swallowed by the darkness. The chanting grew louder, echoing between the trees. Josh and I exchanged a look, a mix of fear and adrenaline. We had to find her. We ran into the woods, the underbrush thick and scratching at our skin. The chanting was louder now, surrounding us, pressing in from all sides. It felt like the forest itself was alive, breathing in time with the slow, steady rhythm. We called Becky's name, but only the chanting answered. Suddenly, the path opened into a small clearing bathed in moonlight. There, standing at the center, was Becky, her eyes wide and unblinking, her mouth moving silently as if in a trance. We ran to her, shaking her shoulders, but she didn't respond. The chanting stopped abruptly, leaving an oppressive silence. Then, from the edge of the clearing, a figure stepped out, a man, tall and gaunt, with pale skin that seemed to glow faintly in the moonlight. His eyes were dark pits, and his smile was too wide, too sharp. Leave this place, he said, his voice low and chilling, or suffer the consequences. We grabbed Becky and fled, not stopping until the woods gave way to the familiar streets of town. That night, Becky never spoke of what happened. She was different afterward, quiet, withdrawn, like she was carrying a secret we couldn't touch. The quarry was avoided after that. No one went near it once the sun went down. But sometimes, when the summer nights are still and the cicadas sing their endless song, I swear I can hear that chanting on the wind, slow, haunting, and calling. Story the end. That summer night in late July is one I still replay in my mind, every detail burned into my memory like a brand. It was the kind of heat that made the air feel thick and heavy, even after the sun slipped below the horizon. I was 19, home from college for the summer, and my friends and I were looking for anything to break up the monotony of small-town life. We'd spent the afternoon at the local pool, the one that closed at sunset, but instead of going home, we decided to drive out to the woods nearby, a place none of us had been before but that older kids whispered about. It was a patch of forest just on the edge of town, known among some for old legends and creepy stories, but nothing concrete. Just the kind of place parents warned you about when you were young. We piled into my friend Matt's beat-up pickup truck, me, Matt, Sarah, and Jason, and drove out a winding dirt road that twisted through the dense trees. The truck rattled over potholes and loose gravel, headlights cutting swaths of pale light into the darkness. The moon was thin, barely lighting the way. We parked near a small clearing, the engine dying with a sputter that sounded too loud in the quiet woods. For a moment, none of us spoke, just listening to the sounds, the occasional hoot of an owl, the rustle of leaves in a soft breeze. It was peaceful and eerie all at once. We grabbed flashlights and decided to hike a little deeper, curious and a little foolish. The trail was narrow and winding, the underbrush thick enough that our flashlight beams barely penetrated beyond a few feet. We joked nervously about the old stories, ghosts of lost hikers, strange disappearances, the kind of tales that kids tell to scare each other. But as we walked, the jokes faded. The woods felt different than I'd expected. Too silent, like the normal nighttime chorus of insects and animals had all stopped. I noticed it first, the sudden stillness. No crickets, no frogs, no birds calling out, just the faint sound of our footsteps crunching over dead leaves. Sarah stopped abruptly and held up a hand. "Do you guys hear that?" she whispered. We all froze, straining to listen. Then it came, a low, dragging sound from somewhere ahead, like something heavy being pulled across the forest floor. We exchanged uneasy glances and picked up our pace, telling ourselves it was probably a fallen branch or an animal. But the sound kept following us, slow and deliberate. Every time we stopped, it stopped. Every time we moved, it moved again. My heart started pounding. I tried to laugh it off, but the laughter caught in my throat. Suddenly, from the side of the trail, a shadow detached itself from the trees. A figure, tall and thin, standing completely still, watching us. It was impossible to make out details in the weak flashlight beams, but the shape was unmistakable. I felt frozen, breath caught in my chest. "Who's there?" Matt called out, voice trembling more than I'd ever heard it. No answer, just silence. We started moving again, faster now, but the figure followed at a distance, always just out of clear sight. Then Jason tripped over a root and fell hard, scraping his knee. The figure stopped as if watching him struggle, then stepped forward a few steps. That was when we all ran. The woods seemed endless, and every tree looked the same. Our flashlights bobbed wildly, casting panicked shadows. We didn't stop until we burst out onto the dirt road, gasping for breath. The truck was still there, but when Matt reached for the keys in his pocket, they were gone. We looked around wildly, the headlights now off and the night pressing in. The figure was nowhere in sight, but the air felt thick, heavy. Suddenly, from behind the trees came a low, guttural growl that made my skin crawl. Matt grabbed a fallen branch and held it like a weapon. We huddled close, terrified and helpless. After what felt like an eternity, the growl faded and the woods returned to silence. We managed to find our way back to the truck and call for help. The police found nothing. No footprints, no signs of anyone else, just the scorched panic in our hearts. That summer night changed everything. I never went back to those woods, and sometimes in the quiet dark, I still hear that dragging sound, slow, relentless, like something that never wants to be found. Story the end. That summer was supposed to be a break from everything. No classes, no stress, just long, slow days in a town that hadn't changed since I was a kid. I was 24, home from college for the first time in months, and the air in our small Ohio town was thick with humidity and the smell of freshly cut grass. Those summer nights stretched endlessly, the kind where the heat presses down on your skin and the only relief is the occasional buzz of a passing car or the distant hoot of an owl. My friends and I had planned to spend a weekend at Jake's family cabin, a weathered old place near Lake Erie. It was the kind of spot that looked out over the water with creaky porches and peeling paint, surrounded by dense woods where you could lose yourself if you weren't careful. The lake was calm that night, reflecting the pale light of the moon, and the sound of cicadas filled the air like a background hum. We arrived just after dusk, the sky streaked with the last reds and oranges of the sun slipping away. Jake, his girlfriend Sarah, and I unloaded the car, carrying bags filled with snacks, beer, and fishing gear. Our plan was simple: spend the evening by the water, fishing until the stars came out, then sitting around the fire sharing stories. As the night deepened, the temperature dropped slightly, but the air stayed heavy, damp with the lake's moisture. The fire flickered, casting long shadows on the sand, and the water lapped gently at the shore. I remember the way Sarah's laughter sounded, light and carefree, the way Jake's eyes caught the firelight, and how for a moment everything felt easy. Then we heard it. A faint noise, at first almost indistinguishable from the wind or the croak of frogs. But it wasn't natural. A rhythmic tapping, like footsteps crunching over dry leaves coming from the edge of the trees behind the cabin. We paused, listening. The forest was dense there, thick with pine and oak, and the darkness seemed to press forward like a living thing. Jake grabbed a flashlight and swung the beam toward the noise. The light caught a flash of movement, something quick and shadowy slipping between the trunks. "Probably a raccoon," he said, but there was an edge to his voice I hadn't heard before. We tried to ignore it, telling ourselves it was just animals moving about. But the sounds kept coming, closer now, a slow and deliberate crunch of feet on dirt. Sarah grew quiet, her smile fading as she glanced nervously toward the woods. "Do you guys feel like someone's out there?" I nodded, the hairs on the back of my neck standing on end. The woods weren't supposed to be this noisy, especially at night, and no one else was around for miles. Suddenly, the tapping stopped. A heavy silence settled over the cabin, broken only by the crackling fire. Then, out of nowhere, a low, guttural growl rolled through the trees, vibrating in my chest. It wasn't like any animal I'd ever heard. It was deeper, almost human, but wrong, like a sound from some ancient nightmare. Jake stood up, shining the flashlight wildly into the darkness. "Who's there?" he called out, voice steady but tense. No answer. The growl came again, closer this time, mixed with the sound of heavy breathing and something dragging across the ground. Sarah grabbed my arm, white-knuckled. "We need to get inside." I agreed. We backed toward the cabin door, trying not to trip over the roots and rocks. As we reached the porch, something large and dark lunged from the shadows, a blur of movement so fast I barely saw it. A scream tore from Sarah's throat as she stumbled back, falling onto the porch steps. I turned and shined the flashlight in the direction the creature had gone. The beam caught glowing eyes staring back at us, feral, unblinking. We slammed the door shut and locked it, hearts pounding. The creature snarled and scratched at the wood, claws scraping the weathered surface. For what felt like hours, we listened to the sounds outside, growls, snarls, heavy breathing, but the creature never managed to break through. Dawn finally began to lighten the sky, and with it, the noises faded. When we finally dared to look outside, there were deep scratch marks gouged into the porch and bite marks on the doorframe. The woods beyond were silent, empty, as if whatever had been out there had vanished. We didn't stay another night. In the weeks that followed, strange things happened around town. Livestock found dead, mutilated in ways no predator would do. People whispered about a creature stalking the woods, a legend coming back to life. I moved back to the city shortly after that summer, but the memory never left me. The way those eyes had looked, the way the growl had echoed in my chest. Sometimes when the wind is still and the night is quiet, I swear I can hear that growl again calling me back to those dark woods by the lake. Story, the end. That summer started like any other in my small town in Kentucky, slow, hot, and sticky, with nights that seemed to stretch on forever. I was 25 then, freshly out of college and back home for the summer before starting a new job in the city. My friends and I spent most of our nights roaming the empty streets, looking for something to break the boredom. That year, the old mill on the outskirts of town became our unofficial hangout. It was abandoned, with its creaking wooden beams and rusted machinery, and locals whispered about strange happenings there. But no one took the stories seriously. One Friday night in late July, my closest friends, Jamie, Carter, and me, decided to meet up at the mill after dark. The air was thick with humidity, and the smell of freshly cut grass mingled with the faint scent of smoke from nearby campfires. We drove out in Carter's beat-up pickup, the headlights cutting through the early twilight as we turned off the main road onto a gravel path that led to the mill. When we arrived, the place looked like something out of a horror movie. Shadows stretched across broken windows, and the wind moaned through the cracked walls. But that's what made it exciting. We brought flashlights and a cooler full of beer, ready for a night of stories and dares. As we explored the mill, the air grew cooler, and the silence was heavy. We joked about ghosts and cursed workers from decades ago, trying to keep the mood light. Jamie found an old pocket watch on the floor and joked that it was cursed. Carter laughed, but even he seemed uneasy. We settled near the old loading dock, sitting on wooden crates when I first heard it, a faint tapping like footsteps on the metal roof above us. We looked up, but saw nothing but the dark sky. The tapping continued, slow and rhythmic, almost like a heartbeat. Suddenly, the lights flickered and went out. For a moment, we were swallowed by darkness, our flashlights barely piercing the blackness. The tapping stopped. Then, from somewhere inside the mill, a low groan echoed. Jamie whispered, "Did you hear that?" We nodded, frozen. A door slammed shut somewhere in the distance, making us jump. I felt a cold breath on my neck, even though the air was warm. Carter grabbed my arm and pulled me toward the truck. As we ran, I looked back and thought I saw a shadowy figure standing in one of the broken windows, watching us. We didn't stop until we were back in town, lights and noise surrounding us again, but the feeling of being watched lingered. Over the next few weeks, strange things happened. Jamie started receiving phone calls with heavy breathing on the other end. Carter found scratch marks on his truck door. I kept waking up to the sound of footsteps outside my window. We never went back to the mill. Sometimes, when the summer nights are still and quiet, I swear I hear tapping on the roof, and I wonder if the figure in the window is still watching. Story the end. That summer night started like any other, the kind of slow, heavy evening where the air feels thick and every breath sticks in your throat. I was 18 and had just finished my junior year of high school in a small town in northern Illinois. One of those places where everyone knows everyone else and nothing ever really changes. The streets were quiet, save for the occasional hum of a passing car or the distant bark of a dog. The cicadas droned somewhere off in the trees, their relentless chorus a soundtrack to the stillness. My two best friends, Lisa and Mark, and I had decided to hang out that night at the old reservoir on the edge of town. It wasn't exactly legal to be there after dark. Locals whispered about the place being dangerous, but that only made it more exciting. We grabbed a few sodas and some snacks, hopped on our bikes, and pedaled out just after sunset. The ride was slow, the air so heavy it felt like we were pushing through molasses. When we reached the reservoir, the water was black and glassy, reflecting the sparse moonlight that filtered through the thin clouds. The place smelled of damp earth and something else, something faint and metallic that I couldn't quite place. We settled on the grassy bank, sitting close together and sharing stories about summer jobs and upcoming plans. The quiet felt good, a rare break from the noise of everyday life. But after a while, Lisa pointed toward the tree line across the water. "Do you guys see that?" she whispered. I followed her gaze and saw it, a faint glow bobbing near the edge of the woods. At first, I thought it was just a firefly or a reflection, but the light moved in an unnatural way, flickering and pulsing as if it were being waved around deliberately. Mark frowned. "Maybe someone's out there fishing?" Lisa shook her head. "No one's supposed to be here at night." We watched the light for a few minutes, curiosity and unease mixing together. Then we heard it, a low scraping noise coming from the woods like something heavy being dragged across the ground. The sound sent a shiver down my spine. I tried to laugh it off, but my voice caught in my throat. Mark pulled out his phone to call it in, but there was no signal. Suddenly, the light disappeared, and the woods fell silent. The only sounds were our own breathing and the rustle of leaves in the breeze. We decided to pack up and leave, but as we stood, I noticed something moving behind us, a shadow slipping between the trees near the water's edge. It was too dark to make out details, but I could feel eyes on us, watching. "Let's go," I said, my voice trembling. We started biking back, trying to ignore the feeling that something was following us. Every time we glanced over our shoulders, the shadow seemed to vanish. When we finally made it back to town, the relief was overwhelming. But even now, years later, I can't forget that night. The way the dark felt alive, the way the silence screamed, and the way we were never truly alone. Story the end. The air was heavy that night, the kind of summer heat that clung to your skin no matter how much you tried to shake it off. The crickets were screaming in the trees, fireflies blinking lazily over the tall grass, and the neighborhood felt quieter than usual despite the distant hum of someone's window unit rattling down the block. I was 17 then, too old to be afraid of the dark, but too young to fully ignore the shiver that sometimes came when the night carried an odd silence. It was one of those nights when the streets of our small town looked washed in pale yellow from the weak glow of street lamps, and every shadow seemed to stretch out longer than it should. I had been hanging out with two of my closest friends, Tyler and Megan. Summer nights had become our thing. We'd walk the neighborhood, sometimes cut through the wooded trails behind the high school, or sneak over to the community pool when it was closed just to sit by the water. That night had started the same as any other. We grabbed gas station sodas and candy, complained about the heat, and wandered aimlessly. But looking back, I can tell you there was a strange tension in the air, even before anything happened. Maybe it was the way the cicadas went silent all at once at one point, or how every house on the block looked dark like people had packed up and left. Around 10:30, Megan suggested we go sit near the old baseball field. It wasn't used anymore, overgrown with weeds, the bleachers half rusted out, but it was one of our favorite spots because no one ever came around. The three of us walked there, cutting across a few backyards and a gravel road, laughing quietly whenever we thought we'd been seen. By the time we got to the field, the sky was completely dark except for a thin sliver of moon. The field looked eerie in that dim light, the chain-link fence casting broken shadows. We sat on the top row of the bleachers, sipping our drinks, just talking. Tyler was telling us a story he swore was true about a man who'd gone missing in town 20 years earlier and was never found. His car had been discovered on the edge of the woods near the very baseball field we were sitting at. I rolled my eyes, thinking he was just trying to creep us out, but Megan got quiet. She had this way of sensing when something was off, and I noticed her glancing toward the tree line while he talked. "Do you hear that?" she whispered suddenly. At first, I thought she was messing around too. But then I listened. The crickets had stopped. The entire night seemed to still, like someone pressed pause on the world. There was only the faint buzzing of a streetlight behind us. I felt my stomach twist. Tyler tried to laugh it off, but I could tell his voice was a little shaky when he said, "Probably just a raccoon or something." But it wasn't the kind of silence that followed normal animal noises. It was the kind that made the hairs on the back of your neck rise, a silence that felt aware. I found myself staring at the tree line too, the wall of dark trees beyond the fence, each shadow too deep to see through. And then, just barely, I thought I saw something move. "Did you see that?" I muttered, leaning forward. Megan grabbed my arm, her nails digging in. "Don't," she hissed. But I couldn't look away. There was someone standing just inside the trees. I was sure of it. The outline was faint, a darker shadow against the black, but I could make out the rough shape of shoulders, a head. Whoever it was wasn't moving, just standing there, watching us. Tyler finally noticed and muttered, "Oh, hell no," under his breath. He tried to sound casual, but he stood up a little too fast. The bleachers creaked loudly, breaking the silence. The figure didn't move. "Let's go," Megan whispered, her voice trembling. We climbed down the bleachers, trying to move quickly without looking like we were running. Every few steps, I glanced back. Um, the figure was still there, unmoving. But when we got about halfway across the field, I looked back again, and it was gone. Just empty trees swaying slightly in the faint breeze. See? It was nothing. Tyler said, forcing a laugh. Our eyes were playing tricks. But I didn't believe that, not for a second. My heart was racing, and Megan looked pale in the moonlight. We picked up the pace and left the field, cutting back toward the gravel road. That should have been the end of it. Just some creepy moment on a summer night, something we'd joke about later. But when we reached the road, I heard footsteps behind us. Not our footsteps. These were heavier, uneven, and definitely not trying to be quiet. "Do you hear that?" I whispered, my voice barely carrying. Tyler stopped and listened. His jaw tightened. "Yeah." Megan grabbed his arm, panicked. "Keep walking. Don't stop." So we did. We didn't run, didn't turn around, just kept walking. But the footsteps followed. They weren't right behind us, but close enough to know someone was there. Crunching on the gravel, stopping when we stopped, starting again when we moved. Finally, Tyler spun around, his voice louder than it should have been in the dead quiet night. "Who's there?" No answer, just silence. We all stood frozen, staring into the dark road. Nothing moved. The shadows stretched long, and the streetlight flickered like it might go out. And then, from the corner of my eye, I saw it again. That same figure. Standing just at the bend in the road, far enough away that I couldn't see a face, but close enough that it was clear it was a person. Just standing, facing us. Megan started to cry softly, muffling it into her sleeve. Tyler swore under his breath, grabbed both our arms, and said, "We're going. Now." We half walked, half ran the rest of the way back to Megan's house, which was the closest. Every few seconds, I'd glance back, but I couldn't see the figure anymore. By the time we got inside her house, locking the door behind us, my chest was tight from panic. We tried to calm down in her living room, the ceiling fan spinning lazily above us, the hum of her mom's old fridge filling the silence. None of us said much. Tyler tried to laugh it off again, saying maybe it was some homeless guy or just someone messing with us. But Megan didn't buy it, and neither did I. There had been something about the way that figure just stood there, silent and still, watching. Something too deliberate. Around midnight, after sitting in silence for a while, we heard something that made my stomach drop. A knock. Not on the front door, but on the window. 3 slow knocks. We all froze. Her curtains were drawn so we couldn't see out, but the sound was unmistakable, knuckles against glass. Megan's face went pale and she grabbed my hand. Tyler stood slowly, his fists clenched. The knock came again. 3 slow, deliberate knocks. Tyler whispered, "Don't look. Don't open it." We sat there in terrified silence, praying it would stop. After a long moment, it did. No more knocking. Nothing, but none of us slept that night. We just sat together, the TV on low for background noise, waiting for dawn. When the sun finally came up, Megan's mom found us all on the couch, pale and exhausted. We didn't tell her what happened. I don't think she would have believed us anyway. For the rest of that summer, I avoided the baseball field. I avoided the gravel road, and every time I walked home at night, I felt eyes on me from the trees, from the shadows. Whoever, whatever that figure was, I knew it hadn't just been my imagination, and sometimes on the hottest, stillest summer nights when the crickets go silent all at once, I still hear those footsteps behind me. Story, the end. The summer air in Ohio always carried a certain heaviness at night, the kind that clung to your skin and made you feel like no matter how many showers you took, you could never quite wash it off. I was 21 that summer, freshly out of college classes for the year, and living back at home with my parents in a small town about 40 minutes outside of Columbus. There wasn't much to do around there, not unless you counted late-night drives down country roads, sitting by the river with friends, or bonfires that sometimes went until sunrise. It was one of those long, warm nights in late June when the air hummed with cicadas, and the heat didn't seem to break, even with the sun gone, that things happened. Things that I've spent every summer since trying not to remember. That night had started like so many others. My friend Jordan texted me around 9, saying he and a couple of others were meeting at the old quarry. Everyone in town knew the quarry. Technically, it was private property, fenced off and posted with no trespassing signs. But it was where all of us teenagers and college kids went. The water was cool even in the dead of summer. The cliffs made for risky but thrilling jumps, and at night the place took on a sort of haunted beauty. You could sit on the rocks with a cooler of beer, listen to music from someone's car, and feel like you were suspended in a world separate from the rest of town. That night, it was me, Jordan, his cousin Kyle, and a girl named Lauren who had graduated a year before us. We weren't a tight-knit group exactly, but it was summer, and anyone who showed up was welcome. We parked our cars at the little dirt pull-off and walked the trail down to the water, flashlights bouncing across the trees. The air smelled like damp leaves and smoke from a bonfire on someone's farm not too far away. By the time we got to the rocks, the moon had risen, bright enough to throw pale light across the surface of the water. We settled in, cracked a couple beers, and let the night take over. For a while, it was just the usual, laughing, talking about nothing, Jordan daring Kyle to jump from the highest ledge, which he eventually did with a loud splash and a curse. But around midnight, things started to feel different. It began with a sound. At first, I thought it was just the night bugs or maybe an animal in the brush, but it was distinct, like footsteps, crunching through the gravel along the trail. We all heard it at the same time, because the conversation tapered off and we turned our heads together toward the trees. The trail was about 30 feet from where we sat, and though the moonlight cut through the gaps in the branches, it wasn't enough to see clearly. "Probably some other kids," Jordan said, a little too quickly. "We don't own the quarry, you know." But the thing was, no one came out. The footsteps stopped just at the edge of where the trail opened up to the water. We waited, expecting to see someone emerge, but the space between the trees remained empty. Kyle called out, "Yo, you lost or something?" No response. He grabbed a flashlight and aimed it down the trail, the beam slicing through the branches, but there was nothing. Just the empty dirt path and the swaying underbrush. He clicked the light off after a few seconds, muttering something about raccoons. We went back to drinking and trying to shake off the unease, but after a while, Lauren said quietly, "Do you feel like we're being watched?" I had felt it too, but I didn't want to admit it. The quarry, as familiar as it was, suddenly seemed hostile. The shadows seemed darker, the water blacker, like it could swallow you whole. Jordan tried to lighten the mood, said maybe it was the ghost of some miner who died when the quarry was still active, but his joke didn't land. Nobody laughed. Instead, Kyle threw another rock into the water, the splash loud in the silence. It might have ended there, just nerves and a strange sound, but it didn't. Around 1 a.m, Jordan suggested we walk the trail around the quarry rim. He said maybe we'd run into whoever else was out there. None of us really wanted to, but nobody wanted to seem scared either. So we set off in a line, our flashlights scanning the ground. The trail wound close to the edge of the quarry, and in some spots you could see straight down to the water glimmering below. It was beautiful, but dangerous too. One wrong step and you could be gone. We hadn't gone more than 10 minutes when we heard it again. The footsteps. This time they were behind us. I froze, my stomach dropping. We all turned around, flashlights cutting through the dark, and for just a split second, I swear I saw movement. A figure, pale and thin, slipping out of sight behind a cluster of trees. "Hey!" Kyle shouted, breaking into a jog back down the trail. His beam swung wildly, but when he got to the spot, there was nothing there. Just the trees and the night air buzzing with heat. He cursed under his breath and came back, shaking his head. Lauren was pale, gripping her flashlight so tight her knuckles showed white. "I saw it too," she whispered. "There was someone there. It wasn't just us imagining things." Jordan tried to brush it off, but even he seemed rattled. "Maybe some homeless guy or some creep messing with us," he said. "Let's just finish the loop and go back." So we did, though none of us talked much after that. Every sound made me jump, the rustle of leaves, the snap of a branch, even the wind. By the time we got back to the rocks, my nerves were shredded. Kyle grabbed another beer, downed half of it in one go, and said, "We should just head out." None of us argued. The walk back to the cars felt longer than it should have. My flashlight beam wavered with my unsteady hand, and every step felt like it was leading us deeper into something we couldn't understand. Then, just as we reached the clearing where the cars were parked, Lauren let out a sharp gasp. I whipped my light in the direction she was pointing, and my stomach flipped. There, standing between the two cars, was a figure. Tall, thin, its skin almost glowing in the moonlight. At first, I thought it was just some guy, maybe high or drunk, but then it turned its head toward us, and the light caught its face. Or what should have been, as there were no features. No eyes, no mouth, nothing. Just smooth, pale skin stretching where a face should be. I couldn't move. None of us could. It stood there, silent, motionless, as though it had been waiting for us. Then, without warning, it stepped backward into the tree line and vanished. Just like that. Gone. Lauren started crying softly. Kyle swore under his breath, and Jordan muttered, "No. No way. No fucking way." We didn't waste any more time. We piled into our cars, engines roaring to life, gravel spraying as we tore out of that clearing. My hands shook so badly on the wheel I could barely steer. The whole drive home I kept checking the rearview mirror, half expecting to see that faceless figure sitting in the back seat. That was supposed to be the end of it. Just one terrifying night. Something unexplainable we could shove down and try to forget. But it didn't end there. In the days that followed, each of us started noticing things. Small at first. I'd wake up in the middle of the night, certain someone was standing in my room, though when I turned on the light, nothing was there. Jordan said he kept hearing footsteps outside his house at night, circling the porch. Kyle swore he saw the figure again while driving down a back road, standing on the shoulder, watching his cars. And Lauren, she stopped coming around altogether. When I texted her, she said she hadn't slept since that night, that every time she closed her eyes, she saw the thing waiting for her. 2 weeks later, she left town to stay with relatives in Indiana. I never heard from her again. The rest of us tried to move on, but the quarry felt cursed after that. No one in our group went back, and I heard later that others had stopped too. People said they saw lights there at night, strange sounds echoing from the cliffs. Maybe it was all in our heads. Maybe it was just fear spreading like a virus through small-town gossip. But I know what I saw that summer night. I know what followed us from that quarry. And I know deep down, it's not finished with me yet. Even now, years later, every hot summer night brings it back. The sound of cicadas in the dark, the weight of the humid air, the feeling of eyes on me when I'm alone. Sometimes I still dream about it, the faceless figure standing just beyond the trees, waiting, watching. And when I wake up, I'm never sure if the dream has ended or if I've simply slipped back into the same nightmare I've been living since that night. Story the end. The air was heavy with heat, the kind that made everything feel slow and sticky, even after the sun had set. The crickets had started their chorus, filling the small town's streets with that steady summer night hum. I was 20 at the time, staying back home with my parents for the summer between semesters at college. They lived in a modest house on the edge of town, close enough to neighbors that you didn't feel isolated, but far enough that once night came, the shadows seemed thicker and the silence deeper than you'd expect. It was one of those nights where the house itself felt alive, creaking as it adjusted to the cooling air. My parents had gone to bed early, both exhausted from work. I couldn't sleep, though. My body was restless, wired in that way it gets during hot summer nights when the sheets stick to your skin no matter how you twist. So I went outside onto the porch, hoping the slight breeze would cool me down. The porch light was off, and the glow of the moon was just bright enough to outline the trees along the edge of our yard. Sitting there, I felt a weird sense of both calm and unease. There's something about summer nights that can trick you. Everything feels so still, so calm. But there's also the possibility of anything lurking just outside your line of sight. I remember thinking that if someone walked out of the woods right then, I wouldn't even hear them over the insects' endless chatter. That thought alone made me grip the armrest of the chair a little tighter. After a while, I decided to take a walk. We lived on a long road with only a few streetlights, and I figured moving might help burn off the restless energy. I didn't even bother with headphones, just slipped on some shoes and started walking, letting the air brush against me. The night was quiet except for the bugs and the occasional distant barking of a dog. I liked walking at night, but this time I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't entirely alone. Every now and then I swore I heard the crunch of gravel behind me, faint and soft, as if someone was trying not to be noticed. I kept glancing back, but the road stretched empty, shimmering in the weak glow of the street lamps. Still, my pace quickened. I told myself it was just animals in the brush, or maybe the sound of my own footsteps bouncing weirdly off the trees. But when I passed the old Miller property, a plot of land abandoned since I was a kid, something made me stop dead in my tracks. The Miller house sat about 50 yards back from the road, a skeletal frame of its former self. Its windows were busted out, and the front porch sagged dangerously, like it might collapse if anyone dared step on it. Kids in town used to say it was haunted, but it was just the kind of place that had a weight to it, a presence that pressed down on you if you lingered too long nearby. That night, though, I noticed something I'd never seen before. In the second-floor window, faint but undeniable, a light glowed. Not the glow of a flashlight flicking around, but steady, yellowish, like a lamp. I froze, staring, my heart thudding in my chest. I knew the place had no power. It had been condemned years ago. There shouldn't have been any electricity, and no one in their right mind would be staying there. Yet there it was, a light burning in a place that had been dark for decades. I wanted to convince myself I was imagining it, maybe seeing the moonlight catching broken glass at the right angle. But as I stared, I could see shadows shifting inside the window, as if someone was moving around. That was enough for me. I turned quickly, heading back toward home, but the uneasy prickling at the back of my neck only grew stronger. Halfway down the road, I stopped again, this time because I heard something. It was faint, carried just far enough by the night air to make me doubt myself at first, but it grew clearer as I strained to listen. Singing, a low, soft humming sound. It was a tune I didn't recognize, but it was deliberate, human. It was coming from behind me, from the direction of the Miller house. My mouth went dry, and I felt my chest tighten. Nobody had any business being in that house, and especially not singing in the middle of the night. I didn't want to look back, but some primal instinct made me glance over my shoulder. The light was gone. The window stood empty, dark, but the singing was still there, louder now, like whoever was doing it was closer. I broke into a jog, my footsteps slapping the pavement too loud in the heavy air. The singing never faltered, though it seemed to follow me, rising and falling as though whoever was humming was walking just far enough behind that I couldn't see them. I pushed myself faster until I reached our driveway, darting up it and practically leaping onto the porch. I yanked the screen door open, slammed the front door shut behind me, and stood there with my chest heaving. The house was silent, my parents asleep upstairs. I tried to calm myself, to tell myself I'd just let my imagination run away with me, that maybe it had been some kid messing around. But as I stood there, the singing came again. This time it was outside the house. Not down the road. Distant. Not down the road, not distant. It was right outside, slow and deliberate, like whoever was doing it wanted me to know they were there. I didn't move. I stood in the dark hallway, my hand still gripping the doorknob, ears straining. The tune was clearer now, and I realized it wasn't just humming, it was actual singing, words too muffled to make out, but with a rhythm, almost like a lullaby. My skin crawled, and every instinct screamed at me not to look out the window. It went on for what felt like forever, though it couldn't have been more than a minute or two. Then it stopped, just cut off mid-note, leaving the night deathly quiet again. I waited, breath held, but nothing else came. No footsteps, no movement, nothing. Eventually, I forced myself to move away from the door, locked it, and sat in the living room with every light on until exhaustion finally pulled me into sleep. The next morning, I thought maybe I'd dreamed the whole thing, that the restless night and the strange atmosphere had gotten to me. But when I stepped outside, the porch boards told a different story. There were footprints. Bare, dusty footprints leading up the steps and stopping right at the front door, as if someone had stood there for a long while, listening. That was only the first night. For the rest of that summer, things didn't go back to normal. I never walked down that road again, but the singing found its way back to me. Sometimes I'd hear it faintly outside my bedroom window, a slow, lilting tune that made my stomach clench with fear. Other times, I'd catch the faintest glimpse of a figure standing at the edge of the tree line near our house, never close enough to see details, but close enough that I knew it wasn't my imagination. My parents never saw or heard anything. To them, everything was as normal as ever. But I knew better. The strangest part was that the singing never seemed angry or threatening on the surface. It was soft, almost soothing, but that was what made it worse. There was something deliberate in it, like whoever it was knew that a calm song in the dead of night could unnerve someone more than screams ever could. I never found out who or what it was. By the time summer ended and I went back to school, the activity had lessened. But even now, years later, hot summer nights bring it all back. When the air gets heavy, when the bugs start their chorus and the world feels too still, I sometimes catch myself straining to hear, half expecting that lullaby to drift through the night again, carrying with it the memory of those bare footprints on the porch. And when I do, I make sure every window is locked and every light is on, because deep down, I know whoever it was wasn't just passing through. They were looking for something or someone. Story the end. The summer night wrapped around the small town like a thick, humid blanket, the kind of heat that seeps into your skin and sticks there no matter how much you sweat. The cicadas were relentless, buzzing in the trees outside my bedroom window, their song a constant drone that never quite lets you rest. It was July in Ohio, and the nights were long, heavy, and still. I was 19, home from college for the summer, and restless. That particular night, I couldn't sleep, so I slipped out of bed, grabbed my shoes, and headed for the front porch. The street was empty, save for a few dim porch lights flickering in the darkness. The neighborhood was quiet, but the silence felt uneasy, like something was waiting just out of sight. I started walking, heading down the cracked sidewalks toward the old park at the edge of town. It was the kind of place kids played in during the day, but after dark, it took on a different personality. A shadowed, forgotten spot where the light barely touched, and rumors whispered through the trees. As I approached the entrance, I heard a soft rustling from the bushes nearby. I stopped and listened, my heart picking up pace. The noise came again, low and deliberate, like footsteps on dry leaves. I told myself it was just an animal, maybe a raccoon or a stray cat, but the feeling that I was being watched settled deep in my chest. I stepped into the park, the beam of my phone flashlight cutting through the darkness. The swings swayed gently in the warm breeze, creaking softly. I moved further in, the air growing thicker with the scent of damp earth and grass. The usual sounds of summer, the distant hum of cars, the laughter of late-night walkers, were muted here, swallowed by the heavy trees. Suddenly, I heard it, a faint whisper, barely audible, drifting on the wind. I froze. It wasn't a voice I recognized, more like a soft chant in a language I didn't understand. The words seemed to curl around me, cold and strange, filling the space between the trees. I called out, "Hello?" My voice sounded too loud in the stillness, and the whisper stopped abruptly. For a moment, nothing moved. Then from the shadows ahead, a figure stepped forward. At first I thought it was a man, but the shape was too thin, too tall, and the way it moved was jerky, unnatural. Its face was hidden beneath a hood, I guess, but the outline of eyes reflected the light of my phone, cold and unblinking. "Leave," it said, voice low and rough, like gravel sliding over stone. I took a step back, fear tightening in my throat. Who are you?" The figure didn't answer. Instead, it turned and vanished into the trees, moving with impossible speed. I didn't hesitate. I ran. The rest of that summer was a blur of sleepless nights and uneasy glances toward the woods. The figure never appeared again, but sometimes, when the cicadas sang loudest and the wind carried that strange whisper, I felt like it was still out there, watching, waiting. Story the end.